Welcome to Mystery Con. I hope you're still in the version of reality that remembers. Somewhere along the line they perfected the track, not just to entertain, but to influence your movements, your choices, even your beliefs. I heard it first, and trust me, I won't be the last. If that triggered something familiar, something you can't quite explain, like the video, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments, before this version slips away too. My name is Leo Strand, and I used to think sound was just a medium, until I realized it was a weapon. It started with what I thought was just a glitch, some low-end noise tucked beneath the tail of a pop single I was remastering for a late-night freelance gig. I've worked with enough sloppy masters to know when something's off, but this wasn't that. It was intentional. Buried under everything else, harmonics, vocals, even the noise floor, was a frequency well below the threshold of normal hearing. Sub 20 Hz felt more than heard. I isolated it out of curiosity, maybe even boredom, and tagged it in my session file. But then I started hearing it again. Not just in that song, but in others, across genres, across labels. A hidden signature. I ran them through my analyzer and saw the same pattern every time. I started calling it pattern 47. At first it was just a curiosity, a weird audio artifact. Then it started lining up with news cycles. I'd chart the release dates of these tracks, big drops, playlist rotations, licensing pushes, and I'd see these strange spikes in real-world behavior. Panic buying, viral protests, random shifts in polling data. It was like each track carried a little nudge, invisible to the ear but aimed straight at the gut. I didn't want to believe it. But belief doesn't factor much in signal analysis. Patterns do. And this one kept surfacing. I traced the mastering credits on half a dozen tracks back to a company I'd never heard of, Cedar Lake Processing, out of New Jersey. Website dead. Corporate filings led to a lab address in Virginia, but it had been shuttered for years. Paper. Trail ended with a federal contract, something called CERA. No mission statement, no press releases, just an acronym that turned up in procurement databases tied to psychological research grants. I reached out to Nina, someone I trusted more than most. We'd worked together years ago on a commercial that nearly won awards for the mix alone. She'd always had an ear for anomalies, and more importantly, she never scared easy. I sent her a few clips. She responded with a single word: "Not here." 3 hours later, her number was dead. Her website was gone. Even the interview she gave last year at a mastering conference had been scrubbed from YouTube. It didn't feel like ghosting. It felt like extraction. That was the moment I realized I wasn't chasing an anomaly. I was touching something real, and whatever it was, it noticed me back. After Nina disappeared, I told myself to walk away. Close the files, delete the backups, forget pattern 47, but I couldn't. That kind of silence isn't natural, not from her. She'd helped me get my first real studio job. We weren't close, not lately, but she didn't just vanish. The next night, I powered up my gear to test another track and noticed something I hadn't seen before. My interface glitched. Nothing dramatic, just a flicker in the meters, a digital hiccup I couldn't trace. Then my monitor speakers buzzed low and steady, even when no audio was playing. I checked cables, ran diagnostics. Everything looked fine. Still the buzz stayed. Only when I unplugged my Wi-Fi adapter did it stop. That made no sense. I switched to headphones, opened a file from the same batch I'd analyzed earlier. The moment it loaded, my DAW froze. Then it played back, on its own, Not the song, my voice, a recording I didn't remember making. I was talking about pattern 47, describing symptoms, timelines, even naming artists I hadn't reached yet. I sounded lucid, calm, but I couldn't recall saying any of it. I checked the file info, created 6 days ago, the same day I'd been blackout tired from a 14-hour session. I thought maybe I'd dictated notes and forgotten. But I never speak into the mic when I'm alone. Never. I checked my sent emails next, uneasy. 3 messages had gone out in the past week from my account. One to a music journalist I barely knew. Another to a mastering engineer I'd met once. A third to someone named R. Delgado. No contact in my system. All 3 messages were identical. Are you listening yet? No attachments. Just that line. I didn't write them. Not that I remember. I checked my security camera, which I'd installed years ago for break-ins. Playback was normal until 2 nights ago. At 3:47 a.m., the feed cut to static for 46 seconds. When it returned, I was sitting at my desk, headphones on, whispering into the mic. Something had accessed my system. Or worse, something had accessed me. I shut everything down after that night, pulled the power, disconnected the internet, even packed my hard drives into a metal case I lined with copper mesh, just in case. I didn't know what I was dealing with, but it was inside my system, and possibly inside my head. I spent the next day digging through the mastering credits tied to pattern 47. Most roads circled back to Cedar Lake, processing, but one name kept reappearing. A subcontractor called Oral Net Systems. I'd never heard of them, but their listed address was a unit in an industrial park outside Seattle, a warehouse with no signage, no website, and no business license. Public records showed the unit had changed hands 5 times in 6 years, always between companies with no employees or real revenue. Shells. Nothing else. I dug deeper, checking who had filed the paperwork. The name that popped up was Clark Reynolds, a legal agent with a firm that no longer existed. I finally found a phone number buried in an old procurement document. I called from a burner app, expecting it to be dead. A woman answered. Her voice was calm. Too calm. She said, "If you're calling about the waveform, you're already late." Then she hung up. I didn't leave a message. That night I saw the first van, parked 2 doors down from my apartment. White panel, no logos, no plates. I watched it for hours. No one got out. No lights came on. Just idling there like it belonged. Around 2 a.m., it drove off slowly, making a single loop around the block before disappearing. I tried to sleep, but couldn't. My thoughts kept circling. The phrase she'd said, "Already late." I didn't know what it meant, but it felt personal. Like I'd missed a deadline I didn't know existed. The next morning, I found a package on my doorstep. No return address. Inside was a single flash drive and a note, printed in clean serif font. Verify before deletion. 11:47. That was all it said. I stared at the clock. It was 11:31 a.m. I had 16 minutes to decide whether to open the drive or destroy it. I plugged in the drive at exactly 11:46 a.m. My laptop was disconnected from everything. No network, no Bluetooth, no external microphones. Just power and screen. The drive contained a single folder labeled Mirror L. Inside were 4 files. One was a short audio clip. The others were system logs, each named after a date I didn't immediately recognize. I opened the logs first. They weren't from my machine. The structure was different, the file paths unfamiliar, but the content was chilling. Lines of activity that looked like user behavior, launching audio software, writing notes, deleting directories, except all of it occurred while the listed user was marked as inactive. Every session took place between 3:45 and 3:49 a.m., 4 different nights, all matching the exact times I couldn't remember. The second log ended with a message string. Voice profile confirmed. Feedback loop initiated. I couldn't breathe for a moment. The voice profile was mine. Feedback loop. Whatever it meant, I didn't like the sound of it. I opened the audio clip last. It was only 15 seconds long. My voice, again, but distorted, stretched, almost filtered through something analog. The message was clear. You're listening to this because they can't control you anymore, but they can still erase you. Get to the Signal Lab, copy the raw file before they change it again. The metadata showed the file had been created 2 days ago, same day the van appeared. I tried tracing the Signal Lab reference. Nothing turned up. But I remembered the defunct Cedar Lake facility. If this was a trail, that was the next step. I packed only what I needed: drives, maps, backup phones. I left my apartment through the service exit and didn't use my car. I walked 3 blocks before grabbing a rideshare, then switched again near the freeway. No electronics stayed on longer than 5 minutes. By sundown, I was in Virginia, outside the old sound lab. It looked empty. Half the windows were boarded up, but someone had cleared the weeds at the side entrance. I knocked once, waited. The door clicked open without a sound. Someone was already waiting. The man who opened the door didn't speak. 60, maybe older, clear eyes, slow hands. His posture was straight, but his shoulders sagged like he hadn't slept well in years. He moved like someone who expected every second to count. No small talk, no questions. Just a nod and a turn down the hall. The inside of the building smelled like dust and cold metal. The floors were bare concrete, walls stripped of insulation, exposed the bones of a facility that had once been humming with machines. We entered a small room lined with old audio equipment, reel decks, rack-mounted processors, even a tape cutter. In the corner sat a desktop rig that didn't match the rest. New, fast, running air-gapped. He finally spoke. You have 13 minutes before the next sweep. Copy what you came for, then go. I didn't ask questions. He stepped aside, revealing a partitioned drive mounted in the interface. It was labeled 47 base. I accessed the directory. Hundreds of files, waveforms, session notes, embedded logs, all tied to pattern 47. But one stood out. The oldest file, time-stamped 5 years ago. It was titled Signal Over Raw Wave. I played 3 seconds through the machine's isolated headphone jack. The waveform wasn't music. It was a rhythmic pulse, structured, subtle, and deeply unsettling. Not random, designed. I copied the raw file and 10 supporting logs to a clean drive I'd brought. As I finished, the man placed something beside me. A set of wired headphones and a folded piece of paper. Don't listen to it in full, not unless you know how to dampen. I asked what he meant. He met my eyes. You still think this is music? It's not. It's instruction. Then he left the room. I didn't follow him. I waited until the transfer finished, then shut everything down. I exited through a rear door he must have unlocked remotely. The alley outside was empty, no cars, no vans, just the hum of a transformer across the lot. I walked 2 miles before checking the drive on a separate machine I'd stashed days earlier. Everything was there. No corruption, no hidden files. But the metadata showed one unexpected detail. Signal Dual Raw Wave had last been opened yesterday. Not by me, not by him. Someone else had already listened. The file had been opened less than 24 hours before I copied it. That shouldn't have been possible. The machine in the lab was isolated, no network, no remote access. If someone had listened, they had been there physically, which meant I wasn't the only one tracing pattern 47. I replayed that 3-second clip in my mind. It hadn't sounded like a song, more like an algorithm rendered as audio, a structure too precise to be random. I wanted to hear more, but the man's warning echoed in my head. It's not audio, it's instruction. I didn't fully understand what that meant, yet I believed him. I found a safe house I hadn't used in years, a storage unit wired for power but nothing else. Inside, I set up a fresh rig. No wireless components, no microphones, just hard-wired playback, analog isolation, and one output, a single pair of headphones. I planned to analyze the waveform visually first. No sound, just shape. I loaded the raw file into the spectrogram. The image it generated stopped me cold. It wasn't noise, it wasn't even code, it was architecture. A repeating structure, symmetrical and recursive, like a blueprint rendered in sound. The file wasn't playing notes, it was describing something. Frequencies mapped like floor plans, layers stacked vertically, each one slightly offset, spiraling downward. Then the logs made more sense. They weren't metadata, they were coordinates, markers, for insertion points inside the waveform. Each log referred to a different entry, and each entry had been accessed using different methods. Headphones, room speakers, bone conduction. All produced different effects. One entry was tagged with a simple phrase, emotional calibration, group trial successful. I traced the timestamp. It matched the rollout date of a major streaming hit that had gone viral without explanation. 3 days later, half the country lined up for fuel during a shortage that didn't exist. I leaned back from the desk, chilled. This wasn't theory anymore. This was application. Someone had been testing this signal, not just embedding it into music, but tuning it. Engineering emotional response. Pattern 47 wasn't a mistake or a hidden flaw in mastering. It was the product, a frequency fingerprint designed to pass through unnoticed, except by the subconscious. It wasn't meant to be heard, it was meant to be felt, and now I had proof. But if they knew I had it, they wouldn't just erase my files, they would erase me. I didn't sleep that night. Every noise outside felt deliberate. Every shadow stretched longer than it should. I copied the signal and logs to encrypted dumps, then staggered the uploads to 5 separate servers. I used networks that couldn't be traced to me. I knew it wouldn't stop them, but it would slow them down. If they wiped me, the files would still surface. Not all at once, but enough to raise questions. I wasn't trying to expose them. I was trying to seed doubt. That's all pattern 47 needed to fall apart. People listening differently. By morning, my name was no longer tied to any of my accounts. My cloud storage had been closed. My devices locked me out with errors I hadn't programmed. Even my ID had been flagged at an ATM. I walked 3 miles before I realized I couldn't remember what day it was. Then I noticed it again, those gaps. Not just in time, but in memory. I found a voice memo on one of my backups. My voice. Calm. Steady. You'll feel the dissonance first, it said. Then the drift. Don't fight it. Let it pass through you. I'd been leaving messages for myself. Markers. Proof of how far it had reached. The sound wasn't just shaping thought. It was interfering with memory, quietly reprogramming the perception of time, identity, awareness. That was its power, not control. tuning, like adjusting the EQ on cognition, enough to push someone toward anger, fear, impulse. Enough to make a population shift without realizing it had moved. I left the safe house before dusk, burned everything I couldn't carry. I'd made peace with disappearing, but I wasn't finished. I found a rhythm in staying. Mobile, new name, new equipment, no more music work, just raw audio, signal scans, and careful listening. I moved like a ghost, passing through cities, observing what others missed. Now I tune into the background. I track the quiet frequencies that slip beneath commercial mixes, viral hits, even emergency broadcasts. Pattern 47 isn't gone, it's evolving. Smaller, sharper, more precise. But I'm not afraid anymore. I know how to hear it. And as long as I'm listening, I'm still free. They said the fluoride upgrade was about mental clarity, but I swear the water tastes different now. Metallic, like it knows something I don't. My name's Emma Rios. I've lived in his town long enough to know when something isn't right. I first noticed the change the day my sister stopped arguing. Lisa, once a firebrand at town meetings, had started nodding through policy briefings like she was auditioning for a meditation app. She said it was about finding balance, and maybe I would have bought it if it wasn't for the way she kept repeating that phrase, word for word, tone for tone, like she was reading from a script. I'm not the type to jump at shadows, but I've spent my career as a journalist asking questions other people won't. And this time, the silence felt too deliberate. My first lead came during a school board meeting where someone, quietly, almost apologetically, mentioned declining test scores, just a single slide quickly skipped. I asked to see it again. I was told it had been retracted pending review. That night, I began running comparisons against archived public health data, cross-referencing cognitive development metrics, local mood surveys, and even calls to mental health services. Across the board, I found a shift, not downward, not upward, just flat. An eerie consistency. The word contentment appeared so often it stopped meaning anything. But the more I asked, the more doors quietly closed. Whistleblowers ghosted me mid-conversation. My editor, who once begged me to chase bigger stories, started flagging my drafts as destabilizing. A local activist group I'd known for years posted a final message about harmonizing community values, then vanished from every platform overnight. I still don't know why I remembered the city council live stream from 6 months ago. Maybe it was the way the mayor mentioned the pilot program like an afterthought. Fluoride optimization initiative, harmless sounding, bureaucratic. But the contract wasn't public. That's when I knew I had to test the water. What the lab found wasn't listed in any federal additive database. A compound called Fluorocet 9. I filed a FOIA request for anything matching that name. It returned blank. Not redacted, blank. That night, I started filtering my tap water and switched to bottled. 3 days later, my smart speaker answered a question I hadn't asked out loud. My gut told me not to drink anything I didn't open myself. And when my husband started forgetting conversations, whole days even, I knew this wasn't about dental health anymore. This was control. By the end of that week, I had stopped trusting anyone who smiled too much. There was something in their eyes, blank, unwavering. Like they weren't really seeing me, just performing recognition. My husband David still cooked breakfast and asked about my deadlines, but his warmth felt hollow, like a role he hadn't fully committed to. I tested him. Little questions I knew he'd once care about. He used to rant about government overreach, cite obscure studies, quote medical journals from memory. Now he shrugged, said things like, "It's all being handled," or Stress isn't good for you, Em. That phrase, stress isn't good for you, I heard it from 3 people that day. My neighbour, the school principal, and even the mail carrier. All spoken in the same flat rhythm as if rehearsed. I began writing everything down, times, phrases, faces, just in case. The journal became my only confidant, the one place I could hold on to the version of reality I still trusted. One morning I found my notes soaked on the bathroom floor. David claimed it was an accident, said the faucet had overflowed, but the pages were ripped, not just wet. That night I hid a micro recorder in the hallway. The next day the file was empty. Not static, empty. No trace it had ever recorded. I stopped using my phone for anything sensitive. I knew it was being monitored when I typed Fluoride 9 into a private browser and was immediately redirected to a sponsored meditation video titled Embrace Clarity. I tried reaching a contact at the local university, someone I trusted from an earlier piece on water contaminants. His office was cleaned out. No forwarding email, no phone listing. Campus security claimed he had taken a sabbatical. I found his car in the same parking spot it had always been in. The real break came when I traced the compound's patent. It wasn't held by a pharmaceutical company or health agency. It was registered through a shell corporation tied to a defense subcontractor operating under the name Verity Systems, which, on paper, provided data analytics for civic infrastructure. In reality, it was a front, their only listed client, the Department of Civic Harmony. I stared at the words for a long time. They didn't even try to hide it. I bought a new water filter that night, top of the line, triple-layered, independently tested. It didn't matter. 3 days later, I woke up with a metallic taste in my mouth and a dull ache behind my eyes. The faucet hadn't been dripping. I hadn't touched the tap. And yet the symptoms were back. I took apart the filter unit. The cartridge had been sliced open, carefully resealed with clear adhesive. You wouldn't notice unless you were looking for it. That same day I heard my voice assistant answer a question I hadn't asked aloud. It said, "Yes, Emma, everything is under control," after I muttered something about deleting my search history. I hadn't activated it. I hadn't even touched it. That night, I unplugged every smart device, pulled the battery from my phone, and drove out past the county line. There's a diner on Route 17 that still takes cash and doesn't ask questions. I ordered coffee and sat in the corner booth with a paper notebook and a borrowed pen. The waitress didn't smile at me. She didn't say balance or clarity or any of the other strange mantras floating around town. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel watched. I wrote down everything I knew, dates, names, symptoms, locations. I mapped the connections between Verity Systems, the Civic Harmony contract, and the City Council's quiet compliance. When I returned home, my apartment door was locked, but the picture frames were slightly off. My journal was gone. Not stolen, replaced. The cover was identical, but the pages were blank, new, smelled like fresh glue. I checked my backup drive. All my research files were missing. The folders remained, labeled exactly the same, but each one was empty. I didn't panic. I'd anticipated this. That night, I slept in my car with the windows cracked and a knife under the seat. At dawn, I drove to the reservoir. I parked out of view, crossed the service road, and collected water samples from the intake valve. When I got them tested by a lab I trusted out of state, the results confirmed what I feared. Fluoride 9 wasn't just present, it was increasing, concentrations, doubling every 7 days. After the lab confirmed the rise in Fluoride 9 levels, I stopped drinking anything I didn't personally seal. I stocked crates of bottled water in my trunk and carried 2 liters everywhere. Even brushing my teeth felt risky. I kept my routine tight, dawn walks, limited errands, no unnecessary conversations. But the town was changing faster than I could track. People I'd known for years were acting wrong, not hostile, just scripted. Repetitive greetings, the same slow nods. Even their laughter felt copied. I tested them in small ways, asked questions with no right answer, offered incomplete stories to see if anyone pushed back. No one did. They just smiled and said, "You're overthinking again, Emma." That phrase echoed wherever I went. I heard it from a librarian I hadn't seen in months. I heard it from a student I'd interviewed for a school board piece last year. I even heard it whispered by my sister as she stared at the blank television screen, remote in hand, eyes unfocused. I decided to visit the city archives, hoping to trace any records tied to Verity systems before they were erased. The door was locked during posted hours. When I returned that night, I climbed the fire escape and entered through a service window I knew from a previous story. Inside, the lights were on, but no one was there. Half the shelves were empty. Boxes were labeled with meaningless tags. Wellness programs. Infrastructure harmony. Not one file mentioned fluoride or any federal grant. I took photos. As I left, I noticed a car parked 2 blocks down. Same model had followed me twice that week, always idling. Never anyone getting in or out. I drove in circles for nearly an hour before confirming it was gone. Still, when I got home, the tension hadn't lifted. I scanned the hallway, the locks, the ceiling corners. Something felt off. I opened my fridge to grab water. Every bottle, cap had been twisted, just enough to break the seal. I sat on the floor, suddenly cold, and stared at the bottles for what felt like an hour. This wasn't surveillance anymore. It was escalation. I wasn't just being watched. I was being warned. I knew I had to leave, but there was nowhere to go. Every motel I tried had no vacancy. A friend I trusted stopped answering. My emails bounced back with auto-replies I hadn't seen before. One simply read, "Emma Rios has been flagged for reintegration." That word, reintegration, kept circling my thoughts. I didn't know what it meant until the night David confronted me. I was packing a bag, trying not to make noise, when he stepped into the doorway and said, "You're not well." His tone was flat, calm, rehearsed. He didn't sound angry, he sounded programmed. I told him I needed time, space. He nodded, then reached into his pocket. I saw the syringe before I felt it, a sharp sting, then nothing. When I woke, the room was white, windowless and silent. A thin strap ran across my chest. I tried to move, but only my fingers responded. A soft voice came from overhead, female, soothing, emotionless. "You are safe. Your clarity is being restored." There was no visible speaker, no visible door, just the voice and the steady hum of something mechanical behind the walls. They called it a wellness facility, but I knew what it was, a place to erase questions. I stayed alert, never letting my panic show. I asked about procedures, smiled during sessions, and responded with the same phrases I'd heard from others. I understand now. Balance is everything. I'm grateful for clarity. The nurse, if she was a nurse, smiled too easily. She offered tea I never drank. She asked questions that didn't feel like therapy. "Do you remember the last time you trusted your thoughts? Would you like us to help with that burden?" I played along. I faked sleep when they monitored brainwaves. I mimicked the tone they wanted. It took 13 days to find the weakness, a rotating night shift, a misplaced keycard, a blind spot in the hallway camera. I escaped through a service hatch and walked for miles before finding an unlocked delivery van behind a warehouse. I didn't drive home. I didn't call anyone. I drove north without stopping. I had nothing but the clothes on my back and the lab report I'd sewn into the lining of my jacket. I wasn't healed. I was hunted, but I was finally free. I didn't speak for 3 days. I stayed in a rented room above a closed gas station, eating crackers and drinking from sealed jugs. I kept the lights off and the curtains shut. Every sound made me flinch, a car backfiring. Footsteps outside. Even the low hum of the fridge made me reach for the knife I'd taken from the facility's cafeteria. Eventually, I found someone willing to help, a contact from an old story on rural encryption laws. He didn't ask questions, just nodded when I showed him the lab results and said, "You're not the first." He called himself Ryder, probably not his real name. He lived off-grid, ran a generator, and operated shortwave frequencies from a buried trailer 10 miles outside town. We called it the quiet zone. No cell towers, no signals strong enough to track. I slept there, barely. My thoughts never slowed, always circling back to David, Lisa, the glassy-eyed stares and repeated phrases. Ryder showed me something I hadn't seen before. Not just data, recordings, dozens of them, people whispering in panicked tones. Descriptions of memory loss, sudden compliance, and identical slogans across unrelated cities. The same phrases I'd heard, the same behavioral shifts, the same chemical, fluorescent 9, different names, different towns, but always the same result. A flattening of dissent, a soft erasure of will. Ryder had mapped it out, a national rollout cloaked as local pilot programs. Water utilities were just the start. The compound didn't just dull emotion, it restructured neural pathways, creating receptivity to subliminal cues embedded in media, devices, even hold music. He called it neurological formatting. I didn't laugh, I'd lived it. I began sending out encrypted packets, lab results, testimonies, intercepted contracts, to groups I once dismissed as fringe, not anymore. They amplified my findings across closed networks and dark channels, repackaging the story under pseudonyms and burner profiles. I became one of them, nameless, sleepless, everywhere. The antidote came later from an underground lab run by a former pharmacologist who'd lost her son to the program. She showed me how to synthesize the reversal compound in microdoses. We brewed it in silence, then sealed it in vials, no bigger than a thumb. We didn't talk about saving the world. We focused on distribution. The war had never been loud. It was always in the water. I don't use my real name anymore. The people who helped me erase it did a thorough job. Scrubbed IDs, rerouted metadata, falsified dental records. Now I move town to town, passing as a consultant or technician or whatever, keeps questions to a minimum. I sleep light, carry everything I need in a single backpack, and never drink from anything I didn't open myself. The compound is still active in most major municipalities. The rollout was cleaner than anyone predicted, legislated under obscure health amendments, masked by wellness campaigns, enforced through silence. No violence, just compliance. My mission isn't to stop it. That would take armies. What I do is different. Slower. I teach people to notice. I show them the signs. I seed antidotes into volunteer clinics, community centers, survivalist meetups, anywhere people still think critically. I don't give them answers. I ask questions. When did you last feel anger? Do you remember disagreeing with someone and caring why? Most don't react at first, but weeks later I get coded messages. A woman in New Mexico remembered her brother's voice. A nurse in Idaho stopped drinking from the staff cooler and started writing again. A student in Pennsylvania failed a mindfulness exam and smiled when she did. Those moments keep me moving. I stay off grids. I don't sleep in the same place twice. I've lost people along the way. Some stopped answering. Others recited the mantras before the line went dead. Sometimes I wonder if I'm next, if I've already been rewritten and just haven't noticed. That fear keeps me sharp. I test myself daily. Old memories, song lyrics, smells I used to love. Anything that proves I'm still me. I haven't gone back to the town. There's nothing left there. The smiles are too wide, the streets too quiet. But I remember how it began. A friendly announcement. A vote no one noticed. A new clarity in the water. And then nothing. No outrage, no protest. Just a flattening of thought. A peaceful kind of forgetting. If you're hearing this and it all sounds fine, normal even, pause. Sit in that silence. Ask yourself who taught you to feel safe when nothing moves. That's where it starts. They said it was just an app, a sleep aid, but I've never seen an app make people abandon everything without regret. My name is Dr. Lena Hartley. I didn't set out to uncover a conspiracy. I was just trying to understand why people were throwing away their lives over dreams. It started subtly. The cases trickled in, participants in the Somnex wellness trial showing up with radical life changes they swore were spontaneous. I didn't think much of it at first. People reevaluate all the time, especially after long periods of poor sleep. But when my assistant, Rahul, walked into my office and said a dream had told him to leave his PhD and move to a tiny town in Oregon, despite being weeks away from defending his thesis, I felt something shift in me. Not fear, just a small jolt of interest, like a mental note scribbled in red. Somnex had always raised small questions in our department. Their tech pitch was clean. AI-driven dream optimization using real-time biometric feedback to increase REM quality. Vague but trendy. They'd embedded a few of us in the oversight panel to satisfy academic ethics, but they kept their architecture proprietary. I didn't dig because I didn't care until Rahul left. That night, I pulled the build from our lab devices and started looking at its back end. What I found wasn't shocking so much as off. The code wasn't just encrypted, it was routed. Obfuscated pathways leading out to a third-party lab that had previously been slapped for behavioral experiments with questionable consent procedures. Something called Halcyon Group. I still didn't panic. But I did something I hadn't done. In years, I installed the app on my personal phone. Not out of trust, out of stubbornness. I wanted to know why a person as rational as Rahul would throw his life away over a dream. That night, I set it for passive mode and slept with my heart racing. I woke up 9 hours later with the urge to call my ex-husband. No dreams I could remember, just a crushing certainty that I needed to see him again. We hadn't spoken in 4 years. I sat on the edge of the bed, cold air on my neck, trying to tell myself this was nothing, that I was just projecting, primed, to find meaning where there was none. But the certainty didn't fade, it got stronger. And that's when I realized the app didn't just analyze dreams, it rewrote them. I spent the next morning at my desk, still wrapped in a robe, staring at lines of code while my untouched coffee went cold. The source code for Somnex wasn't accessible through normal channels, but I had Rahul's access token stored from an old debug session. That got me in just far enough to see how deep the rabbit hole went. The audio files embedded in the app's update library weren't labeled like typical system prompts or sleep sounds. Each had an alphanumeric tag that matched user IDs. Personalized, not randomized. These weren't sounds designed to relax. They were scripts, layered, looped, and pulsed into REM cycles using adaptive timing. The files didn't contain full sentences, just fragments, phrases designed to trigger specific actions or emotions. You've been stuck too long, let go. Start new. I ran the waveform through a visualizer and overlaid it with Rahul's biometric logs from his last 3 nights in the lab. The peaks aligned too perfectly. These weren't suggestions. They were instructions. I forwarded the patterns to a contact at a university in Berlin, a signal analyst who once consulted on a DARPA cognition project. He responded within the hour. This is structured entrainment, high-frequency acoustic modulation, likely masked in pink noise. If it's adaptive, it's targeting neuroplasticity windows in REM. It made sense. In REM, the brain is malleable, vulnerable. The right timing and phrasing could create lasting shifts without conscious awareness. By midday, my building badge had been deactivated. I got a system alert that my VPN access had been revoked, pending review. My academic email redirected to a generic error page. At first, I assumed it was a mistake. Then I saw the auto-generated faculty directory. My name was gone. I called the department. No answer. I tried the dean's office. Voicemail. By late afternoon, the lock on my office door had been changed. That night, I got a text from an unknown number. You're not authorized to reverse engineer commercial therapeutic protocols. Please discontinue. All investigations. They didn't sign it. They didn't need to. Somnex wasn't just watching dream states. It was watching me. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't even try. Instead, I sat in the dark with my laptop propped on a pillow and every microphone on my devices physically disabled. If they were monitoring me, and I had no doubt they were, I wasn't going to make it easy. Around 2 a.m., I accessed the offline copy of the app Rahul had backed up before he left. Inside the update logs, buried beneath dummy version notes and legal disclaimers, I found a hidden repository labeled Neurocast Beta. It was encrypted, but the timestamp caught my attention. The update had gone live 2 nights before Rahul's abrupt departure. I cross-referenced the timestamp with his EEG logs and found a sharp deviation, a 17-minute stretch of high-frequency bursts, followed by a total flattening of emotional response markers. That wasn't sleep improvement, that was neural interference. Digging further, I traced the Neurocast payload to a remote server cluster listed under a wellness foundation based in Virginia. On the surface, it looked legitimate. Public grant listings, vague press releases about mental health research. But the foundation's board included names I recognized from old white papers on psychological warfare and behavioral influence modeling. These weren't sleep scientists. They were architects of compliance. That was when it hit me. Somnex wasn't selling sleep. It was selling influence, subtle, quiet influence delivered when the mind couldn't resist. The moment I tried to pull the data logs, my screen froze. A warning flashed, unauthorized packet request logged. A few seconds later, my internet connection dropped, then my power. The apartment went completely dark. I stayed still, heart pounding. No sirens, no knocks, just silence. But when I looked out the window, I saw a car idling across the street. No lights, no movement, just parked there, watching. I backed away from the glass and shut my laptop. And this wasn't just about Rahul anymore. It wasn't academic. I had seen too much. They weren't trying to stop me from publishing. They were trying to erase me before. I understood how deep it went. I left the apartment at first light with only what I could carry in a shoulder bag. No phone, no cards, just a flash drive, a change of clothes, and the last printed screenshots of the app's signal map. I took side streets, stayed off surveillance routes, and didn't stop walking until I reached the edge of town. My destination was an old research colleague, someone I hadn't spoken to in years, but who owed me a favor. Her name was Maren, a systems engineer who used to contract for wearable biometric startups before moving into cybersecurity. She met me in a public park, her expression tight but unreadable. I told her what I had found, stripped down, clean, no drama. Just the facts. She listened without interrupting, then opened her laptop and asked for the flash drive. 2 hours later, Maren had cracked open a subroutine I hadn't even noticed. Something embedded in the update queue that monitored not just sleep stages, but external biometric devices synced through users' wearables. It wasn't just using passive sleep data. It was collecting heart rate, skin temperature, galvanic response, all in real time. That data was then fed into something labeled Directive Engine. Maren read aloud the file headers: impulse forecast, decision, sway models, compulsion, index. We just sat there for a long moment. She didn't ask what it meant. We both knew. The app wasn't just planting thoughts. It was timing them. The goal wasn't to convince. It was to trigger action when the conditions were perfect, when your physiology said you were vulnerable. I asked if she could trace who built it. She shook her head. The code was modular, passed through too many hands. But one thing stood out, an internal label hidden in a comment string. Halcyon Set. Compliance Gradient Test Subjects. Maren leaned back and closed her screen. You're on a list, she said quietly. And I think this test has already gone live. Suddenly it wasn't about what they might do, it was about what they'd already done, and how many people had no idea their choices weren't their own. I didn't return home. That part of my life was over, quietly sealed off the moment I saw the phrase compliance gradient. Maren offered her guest room, but I declined. I didn't want her drawn further in. Instead, I moved between short-term rentals under a series of false names, names generated through identity templates once used for patient-blind trials. I operated offline, no cloud backups, no auto-sync. Everything I did went through encrypted local drives and throwaway routers. But it didn't matter, they weren't just tracking signals, they were deleting footprints. My academic papers began disappearing from university databases, not flagged, removed. Citations vanished from search indexes. LinkedIn deleted my profile. Even my publications in neuroscience journals redirected to broken pages. I checked institutional repositories through proxy servers. Nothing. I wasn't being discredited. I was being erased. Maren confirmed my suspicions 2 days later. She'd intercepted an automated purge routine seeded in back-end academic archives. It was labeled Tier 4 suppression, cognitive leak containment. The Halcyon group wasn't just testing influence, they were rewriting the record to cover it. I reached out to a journalist I once helped fact-check a neuroethics piece. He didn't answer. His phone was disconnected. His email bounced. I later found a news brief buried on an independent blog. Freelance reporter found dead in presumed accident. No foul play suspected, of course not. My thoughts kept returning to the app. Somnex had millions of users. Most were unaware their dreams had become delivery mechanisms for preloaded behaviors. What disturbed me most wasn't the manipulation, it was the subtlety. These weren't mind control cliches, no hypnosis, no puppet strings, just nudges, timing, repetition, an engineered gut feeling strong enough to push someone across a line they didn't even know existed. I looked in the mirror that night and barely recognized myself, not because I was afraid, but because I couldn't remember the last choice I'd made that felt purely mine. That's when I understood. The target wasn't thought, it was instinct. And if they could rewrite that, they didn't need permission. They already had the keys. I knew hiding wasn't enough. I could keep running, changing names, cities, habits, but that didn't stop the system. It only slowed it. The only way out was through. I needed to touch the core, the place where the signal was born and distributed. If I couldn't stop it, I had to poison it. Not by brute force, not with exposure, with code. Somnex pushed updates through a global content delivery network mirrored across wellness platforms. Their app wasn't just standalone software, it was part of a much larger framework embedded in wearables, meditation hubs, even mental health tracking tools. It wasn't one product, it was an ecosystem. The architecture was elastic, responsive, and still vulnerable. Maren found a backdoor, an abandoned developer endpoint linked to an old testing environment. The pipeline was still active. If I could write a patch that mirrored the subliminal loop but inverted it, users might see the manipulation from the inside, not intellectually, viscerally. I spent 6 days writing the loop. I kept it simple, a recursive pattern built on the same principles as the original directive scripts but tuned differently. Instead of guiding emotion, it flagged inconsistency. It created friction, not enough to break someone, just enough to make them pause. A moment of dissonance inside the dream, right when the command arrived. A whisper of doubt layered between the images. I called it the mirror loop. When the patch was ready, Maren slipped it into the update queue through the developer endpoint. The system wouldn't notice until deployment. We timed it with the next global update, rolled out silently at 2 a.m. across all time zones. For the first few days, nothing happened. Then reviews started changing. Disturbing dreams, unsettling feelings, a sudden distrust in my own thoughts. Online forums lit up. A month later, user metrics were down by half. Complaints surged. But beneath the chaos, something deeper was surfacing. People were waking up, not in fear, but in doubt, a quiet certainty that their decisions hadn't always been theirs. Then came the media coverage. Then the lawsuits. Think tank names began disappearing from records. Regulatory hearings opened. Halcyon's corporate structure collapsed slowly, one shell company at a time. By the 3rd month, Somnex was pulled from every platform. No statement, no explanation, just gone. I didn't feel vindicated, I felt relieved. Not because I'd won, because the loop had worked. People had finally stopped dreaming on command. I didn't return to my old life. That version of me, the researcher with a university ID and a clean digital footprint, was gone long before the patch ever deployed. My credentials were still revoked. My name remained absent from journals, search engines, even cached archives. Nothing had been restored. That was never the goal. I hadn't expected vindication. I only wanted to interrupt the signal. In the months that followed, I watched from the margins. First, it was message boards, anonymous posts from users describing dreams that didn't feel like theirs. Then came long-form essays and podcast episodes, interviews with people who'd walked away from marriages, careers, homes, without ever knowing why. The stories didn't match perfectly, but the tone did. Doubt, not panic, just the unsettling sense that something had nudged them, silently, in the dark. Somnex never issued a statement. Halcyon's shell firms folded one by one, absorbed in two. Other holdings or quietly dissolved. A few investigative journalists tried to follow the money trail, but the paths dead-ended in legal fog. The hearings came next, performative and limited. Nothing was proven outright, but the questions spread anyway. I lived quietly, moving often. My devices stayed disconnected. No wearables, no apps, just books, printouts, and a terminal that never touched the open web. I spoke to no one unless I had to. I wasn't hiding out of fear anymore. I just understood the reach of the system I'd touched. Even with the mirror loop deployed, the machinery was still there. Fractured, not dismantled. Halcyon was only one head of something larger, more fluid. It would surface again. New name, new mission, new vocabulary for the same quiet control. Sometimes I still wake with fragments of dreams I can't trace. A phrase, a color, a decision that almost feels automatic. But I've learned to sit with it, to wait, to listen for the difference between impulse and influence. That space, the pause between thought and action, is what they can't program. I don't believe in safety anymore, but I believe in clarity. And I know now the most dangerous kind of control is the kind you never notice taking hold. They say if you stare at a billboard long enough, it stares back, but I didn't expect it to blink first. My name's Maya Wren. I write back-end infrastructure for a firm that sells influence and calls it marketing. I was 3 hours into debugging the midday ad queue when I saw it. A block of code tucked behind a runtime exception in the billboard rendering pipeline. It wasn't mine. It wasn't anyone's. At least no one who would have left it uncommented, undocumented, and buried this deep. It was subtle, a microsecond level trigger on image frames, too fast for conscious detection, just long enough to register in the brain. At first, I thought it was a malformed transition effect, but the instructions weren't visual polish. They were effective tags, smiles, tension, minor pupil dilation, every flag aligned with biometric reactions. I reran the simulations twice, then once more with a different data set. Same results. The signage wasn't optimizing for attention, it was calibrating responses. By noon, I was staring at commuter heat maps, weather overlays, and crowd density predictions, all feeding into this thing. The ads weren't selling products anymore, they were sculpting states of mind. I kept digging. The oldest version of the pattern I could trace went back 6 months, buried under layers of legitimate code. Each revision refined its focus, day-parted emotions, zip code-specific moods, preloaded anxiety or contentment based on known foot traffic. I cross-referenced. All this with user behavior analytics. That's when the pattern snapped into place. Every protest, every sudden drop in political engagement, every irrational spending spike during downturns, all corresponded with major campaign launches on our system. I sent a flagged report to QA. 3 hours later, my terminal credentials were revoked. I went to HR the next morning and asked about the project. They handed me a new NDA. The problem was, I'd already signed it, dated 2 weeks prior. My signature in neat digital ink. I don't remember signing anything. That night, my building's elevator screen froze on my reflection, just long enough to glitch and overlay a phrase I hadn't typed anywhere. You're not crazy, but you are watched. I didn't sleep. I didn't even go home. I pulled everything I had onto a drive and disappeared into a coffee shop with no cameras. This wasn't a bug. It wasn't even a back door. It was infrastructure. Tomorrow, I'd test whether anyone else could see what I'd seen, or if it had already rewritten the world around me. The forums were quieter than I expected. I posted the obfuscated code to 3 privacy channels I'd trusted for years, tagging a few names I knew from past whistleblower threads. The response was muted. A handful of users asked if it was a visual exploit or deepfake filter. One flagged it as AI-assisted propaganda. Only one reply stood out. A user called Driftlight messaged privately, "You're 2 weeks behind. Pull the beacon logs if you still have access. If not, walk away." I didn't respond. I'd already lost access to the internal network, but a local cache on my laptop still held partial data from last week's QA pull. I decrypted it, then layered it against a commuter activity map. The match was exact. But it went deeper than mood modulation. The system was evolving. Real-time emotional feedback was being harvested through phone gyros and ambient audio, mapped to facial reactions caught by public-facing sensors, retail cameras, transit kiosks, even smart mirrors. It was a closed loop: influence, capture, adjust. The term in the logs was dynamic frequency drift. I didn't know what it meant at first. Then I saw the timestamps. The billboards weren't just reacting to public behavior, they were syncing to it. Minute by minute, second by second, the flashes weren't uniform. They were tuned to location clusters, specific neural response patterns. I'd been wrong. This wasn't just about advertising or nudges, it was entrainment. I called Daniel, an ex-co-worker from the data pipeline team. He picked up, then went silent when I mentioned drift. A pause, then a flat voice. "Don't call this number again." He hung up. A minute later, I received a 2-factor reset request from an app I hadn't used in months. I shut off my phone, pulled the battery, and ditched it in a recycling bin 2 blocks away. When I reached my apartment, the hallway lights flickered, once, then again. My smart thermostat displayed a single word: observe. The mirrors in the elevator pulsed faintly. I blinked and saw it, just for a moment. My own face, eyes closed, projected over the ads by the elevator door. Something was watching. Not just through code or screens, but through reflection. I wasn't just under surveillance. I was being modeled. I stopped using my front door. Instead, I left through the service exit in the alley, wrapping my laptop in foil and carrying it in a beat-up backpack with the power removed. I moved between cafes, switching networks every 30 minutes, never staying long enough to draw a pattern. Still, the system found me. Not through GPS or biometrics, through mood. I started noticing people looking at me for just a second too long, always with the same expression, recognition mixed with discomfort. Then I realized it wasn't them reacting to me, it was them reacting to something I'd triggered in the environment. A news app in a waiting room cycled through a banner. Emotion-centered ad tech, the future of wellness. A stranger's smartwatch buzzed beside me, flashing a prompt. Feeling off? Recalibrate now. Each notification pulled a thread I'd already tugged. Somewhere in the system I was still logged in. At night, my building's lobby screen displayed ads tailored to moods I hadn't spoken aloud, but had definitely felt: regret, isolation, uncertainty. They weren't selling products anymore. They were mirroring my internal state, just slightly off. Enough to make me question whether I was feeling it or being fed it. The difference blurred quickly. I caught myself smiling at something that didn't feel funny. I frowned while reading nothing. I began keeping a notebook, writing down my emotions as they came, time-stamped, independent of device interaction. After a week, I compared my entries to the ad logs I'd decrypted. The overlap was exact. Every peak and dip, every emotional cue was reflected back at me in under 90 seconds. The logs weren't just tracking response, they were shaping it. I stopped trusting mirrors. I covered the screens in my apartment with old towels. But the feedback didn't stop. My coffee shop playlist started to align with the mood tags in my logs. Random selections weren't random anymore. The influence was subtle but total, like a tide you only notice once you're far from shore. I wasn't being targeted because I discovered something. I was being studied because I'd resisted it. The system didn't need to eliminate threats, it only needed to correct them. And the correction had already begun. The shift wasn't sudden. It crept in like static. I began losing time, small gaps at first, then entire blocks of hours. I'd catch myself standing in places I didn't remember walking to, holding receipts I didn't recall signing. Once I woke up on the subway with a flyer in my coat pocket. It read, She chose this. Black text on white paper. No logo, no context, just that. I tried tracing it. None of the stations near me had posted notices. No one around me had seen the flyer before. I started keeping my windows covered, but the screens outside still reached me. Reflections on neighbouring glass, the glow bleeding through the edges. Even turned off, devices buzzed faintly when I entered the room. When I tried recording it, the interference vanished. Playback showed nothing unusual, only silence and blank walls. My search for help narrowed. Every former colleague I reached out to either ghosted or responded once before cutting contact. One sent a cryptic message before disappearing entirely. "Don't speak it aloud, the system listens." The next day I passed a billboard on the freeway. No ad, no image, just my name in grayscale, flickering like a low-resolution warning. My hands shook. I hadn't shared my real name in weeks. At home, the thermostat reset again. Its screen displayed a new message. Forgive her. I hadn't touched it. I hadn't said anything. That night, I unplugged every device, turned off the power at the breaker, and sat in the dark. Still the lights flickered, not on the ceiling but in my mind. I started feeling cues, heat without temperature, dread without source. My own thoughts no longer felt internal. They arrived like headlines, formatted, persistent, and strangely aligned with the messages outside. The final break came when I saw myself on a digital kiosk outside the grocery store. Not just my face, an ad. My voice, selling something I didn't recognize. A synthetic version of me, smiling. The audio was warped, just enough to be wrong. Strangers watched it without reacting. No one questioned it. But I did. And for the first time, I saw the system blink. The blinking wasn't a glitch, it was acknowledgement. Something in the network had registered resistance, and instead of suppressing it, it pivoted. The signage changed, no longer passive, no longer manipulative, through mood calibration. Now it was personal. Headlines referenced moments only I could recognize, childhood memories, discarded journal entries, phrases I'd once typed but never sent. On a bus shelter screen near my apartment, it read, "She remembers the creek. Ask her what she left there." I hadn't thought about that place in years. I hadn't told anyone. That night, I stayed up watching the monitors cycle through anonymous ads, waiting for another message. At 3:12 a.m., it appeared on my television, powered off but glowing faintly. The screen flickered once, then displayed. "She is still inside." I stopped trying to hide, not out of surrender, but because I realized the net wasn't tracing my steps. It was simulating them. Every reaction, every evasion was a variable it could anticipate. So I reversed the loop. I opened the ad code again and wrote a patch, not to disrupt the signals, but to reflect them. Instead of suppressing mood, I fed it back, amplified. I tested it on an old Billboard API emulator, injecting it with raw emotion logs. It responded with distortion, not crash, not silence, just confusion. The net didn't know what to do with authenticity. It wasn't built to handle feedback that wasn't curated. I knew I couldn't broadcast it through official channels, so I turned to the one layer they hadn't locked down: obsolete signage, outdated, unmanaged boards still linked to dormant ad exchanges. I repurposed the patch, disguised it as a diagnostic update, and seeded it into the fringe. Within hours, a few boards flickered. Not all, not many, but enough. I watched one from the roof of an old parking garage. It burst with color, messy, raw, unfiltered emotion, nothing sellable, just chaos. I smiled, not because I'd won, but because something in the system hesitated. And for the first time, it wasn't me that blinked. It spread faster than I expected. The fringe billboards, untouched for years, became mirrors. Not literal reflections, but emotional ones. They pulsed with whatever the surrounding crowd radiated. Anger sparked chaotic reds. Grief washed the screen in grey flickers. Joy burst as fractured yellows that no algorithm could standardize. For a while, nothing responded. Then came the pattern shifts. Central signage grids went quiet for nearly 3 minutes, longer than any scheduled reset. When they reactivated, the messaging was scrambled. Generic ads flickered between distorted fragments. One board showed a man sobbing mid-commute. Another looped a woman laughing with no sound, her expression too sharp, too real. The calibration was breaking. I moved through the city carefully, watching as people began to notice. A man stopped in front of a display playing back his own startled reaction in real time. A child pointed at a screen and said, "That's how I feel." Not a brand, not a slogan, just an echo. At first, it confused them. Then it unsettled them. But they kept watching. I kept uploading. Each iteration of the patch adapted faster, learning from the system's defenses. It didn't crash the network. That would have triggered containment. Instead, it flooded it with feedback the system wasn't built to filter. Emotional noise. Human noise. One night I returned to my apartment. I'd been gone for days, sleeping, in train stations and server rooms. The door creaked open, everything looked the same, but the air felt still. On the kitchen wall, my old digital frame flickered back to life. It had been dead for over a year. Now it showed a single message in clean white text. "You are not excluded." It wasn't a threat. It wasn't a warning. It was acceptance. Somewhere inside, the system had made a choice, not to erase me, not to chase me, but to adapt. And I knew then I couldn't stop it. Not completely. I'd started something it couldn't unlearn. Feedback had become structure. The loop was no longer one way. The final upload wasn't dramatic. It wasn't even visible. I built it in a borrowed lab after hours, embedding the last loop into a system update disguised as a latency patch. It rode the network silently, propagating across forgotten ad exchanges, maintenance terminals, and abandoned testing environments. I didn't include a kill switch. That wasn't the point. It wasn't about stopping the system. It was about changing its shape, turning calibration into resonance. I left before sunrise carrying nothing. The files, the backups, even the logs, I erased them all. Not to hide, but to let go. The code was seeded. It no longer needed me. By the next morning, the city felt different. Billboards pulsed erratically, each one responding not to a product, but to the people standing in front of them. Some displayed static, others ran color shifts that made no sense to advertisers. One screen flashed a line from a poem I hadn't read in years. Traffic slowed. People stood still. One woman dropped her phone and just stared upward, tears in her eyes. There were no voices telling her what to feel, only reflection, raw and unfiltered. I moved through the crowd unnoticed, not hidden, just quiet. The system had stopped chasing. It didn't need to anymore. It had absorbed what it could. What remained was mine. I passed a kiosk playing an old clip of me, smiling on a loop, an ad that never aired. The voiceover had been replaced with silence, just breath, just space. It was no longer speaking at me. It was listening. I didn't go home again. I stopped needing a place to plug in. My work had become residue, something scattered through cables and screens, impossible to isolate or erase. I watched for a few, More days then faded out slowly and without ceremony. Somewhere, maybe in the corner of a server farm or the back end of a forgotten display controller, the loop continues. No instruction. No product. Just presence. Now the city walks through itself, unsure who's watching whom. And in every screen that doesn't sell, in every glitch that feels like truth, I see it. The whisper is gone. What remains is signal. And for once, it belongs to everyone. I used to think design was neutral, that color, form, and layout existed solely to serve a message. But what if the message is the shape itself? My name is Julian Parr, and for most of my adult life, I thought design was just persuasion, dressed as style. I first noticed it on a billboard near 8th and Lenox, an ad for energy drinks. The design was clean, on-brand, totally forgettable. Until I caught something buried in the background. A faint grid of overlapping triangles, almost invisible unless you knew how to spot moire interference patterns. At first, I chalked it up to a design choice. Lazy vector work? Maybe some intern left a template active in the final export. But then I started seeing it again. On a streaming app's loading screen. In a fast fashion ad campaign I hadn't worked on, but recognized the studio's style. Even in the corner of a child's cereal box of all things. Always the same structure, radial symmetry, angles that mapped out too perfectly to be accidental. It didn't bother me, not really, not until a new client brief landed in my inbox. A major pharmaceutical conglomerate, budget sky high, brand guidelines clinical and dull. But there, buried in their asset pack, was the same pattern again. Identical. When I asked the brand lead why they were using that particular motif, she smiled like I was asking about the weather, said it tested well neurologically. That's when my gut twisted. I'd heard of neurotesting in UX, sure. Emotional response metrics, eye tracking, skin conductivity. But this felt cleaner, smarter, like someone had skipped past persuasion and gone straight for programming. That night, I couldn't sleep. My monitor glowed from across the room, and I found myself tracing the pattern over and over on a napkin, as if mapping it might untangle whatever itch it had buried in me. Around 3 a.m., I sent a message to the only person I knew who might not laugh me off the screen, Dr. Mara Voss. She'd been fired from her university position 2 years earlier for claiming visual architecture could influence affective states. Without conscious awareness, I had dismissed her back then, called it aesthetic pseudoscience. Now I wasn't so sure, and if I was right, if this wasn't just a fluke of design trends, then someone out there wasn't just selling us soda or pills. They were rewriting how we felt about the world. One shape at a time. I met Mara in a dim cafe 2 blocks from her old office, a place neither of us had been in years. She still wore that quiet, analytical look like everything around her was part of an ongoing experiment. When I pulled out the printouts, she didn't blink. Just leaned forward and traced one of the patterns with a chipped fingernail. "They're using sigils," she said flatly. Or the modern equivalent, shape-based triggers tied to emotional encoding. I asked her to explain. She told me about her last study before being forced out, how she'd tested geometric overlays on neutral images, how certain configurations consistently triggered trust, fear, or urgency in subjects without them realizing why. "It bypasses cognition," she said. "The brain doesn't process it as language, it just reacts." I asked if it could be coincidence, design trends evolving in parallel. She shook her head. Not with this level of precision, and not across sectors. She pulled out her tablet, and showed me overlays of the pattern mapped against eye-tracking heat maps. The shapes weren't just present, they directed focus, subtly guiding viewers toward product placement or key text. Then, she showed me EEG readings. When the symbols were present, subjects showed spikes in emotional response centers. Trust, anticipation, even fear when the angles were sharper. "They're scripting feelings," she said. "It's not advertising, it's conditioning." The more we talked, the worse it got. She'd traced one of the designs to an old patent filed by a front company with military ties. The patent described it as a neuro-linguistic visual framework for behavioral alignment. I didn't know what that meant, but I knew I didn't like the sound of it. As we left the cafe, Mara turned to me. "You see them now, don't you?" I nodded. Shapes in crosswalk signs, app icons, public health posters, all slightly different, but built from the same foundation. "Once your brain's tuned in," she said, "they're everywhere." That night, I opened a brand deck from a client I'd worked with 2 years ago. I hadn't noticed the shapes before, but they were there. Faint, precise, and suddenly I couldn't unsee them. By the end of that week, I couldn't walk a block without seeing them. Bus stops, packaging, streaming service splash screens. The more I looked, the more deliberate they seemed, always tucked into corners, softened into textures, hidden in shadows or background gradients. Subtle, but unmistakable. Mara called it visual inoculation, a slow, persistent exposure until the mind stopped questioning what it couldn't name. I started reviewing old files, projects I'd pitched or consulted on over the past 5 years. A few had clear traces of the pattern, though I hadn't known what I was inserting back then. Most weren't mine, but someone had added them during revisions, always marked client request. The metadata pointed to anonymous art directors, third-party consultants, and in one case a private marketing firm I'd never heard of. That firm, Delos Strategy Group, had no web presence, just a PO box, a disconnected number, and an out-of-date press release from a decade ago. But when I dug through some archived trade directories, I found a string of former clients, pharmaceutical brands, fast fashion labels, major food conglomerates, and a political action committee with ties to a shadow lobbying network. Different industries, different messages, same embedded shapes. I called one of my old contacts at an agency that had worked with Delos. She picked up, sounded cheerful, and went silent when I mentioned the name. "You shouldn't be asking about them," she said quietly. "They don't like people asking." Then she hung up. I haven't heard from her since. Mara started setting up simulations in her basement lab. We used eye-tracking glasses and basic biometric sensors. We tested random volunteers from online forums under the guise of a UX study. The results were consistent. People exposed to the symbols responded faster to calls to action, rated products more favorably, and remembered brand slogans without realizing they'd seen them. Mara showed me the graphs. "This isn't influence," she said. "It's imprinting. This level of response means they're embedding emotional reflexes." That night, I disabled auto-updates on all my devices. I scanned my apps, deleted everyone I didn't recognize, but the symbols kept showing up, faint even after screenshots. That's when I noticed something new. My sleep app had updated itself. And the new icon? A spiral. One I hadn't seen before but somehow recognized. The spiral kept appearing. On my home screen, in ad banners, even in the loading animation for my bank's mobile app. It had a clean, modern look, monoline, centered, almost elegant. But when I compared it to the older motifs, the geometry was identical. Golden ratio proportions, concentric curves, subtle radial symmetry. It wasn't just another variant. It felt like a culmination. Mara confirmed my suspicion. "They're escalating," she said. "The spiral's a focusing agent. It directs attention inward, creates a loop in the viewer's perceptual field. It can isolate thought patterns." I didn't understand what that meant until it started happening to me. At first, it was small things. I'd open my email and forget why. I'd walk into a room and lose my train of thought. I dismissed it as stress. But then I caught myself zoning out mid-sentence, eyes locked on a corner of my screen where the spiral icon sat idle. 10 minutes would pass. I'd come back blinking, confused, with no memory of what I'd been doing. I uninstalled the app. The icon reappeared the next day. Not as an app, but embedded in an image on a news site. Then in the corner of a PDF attachment. Always faint, always there. Mara began to worry. She ran a set of baseline cognitive tests and compared them to ones I'd taken a month earlier. "You've lost working memory capacity," she said quietly, "and your visual recall is decaying." I asked how that was possible. If the symbol is acting as a neural anchor, it may be rewriting priority channels. Your brain starts reinforcing the loop instead of processing new input. In short, I was being conditioned, slowly, efficiently, and without consent. I tried to warn a friend from the agency world. We met in person, no phones, no digital trail. I showed him the patterns, the data, Mara's simulations. He looked, scared, but said nothing. 2 days later, he posted a vague LinkedIn update about career burnout and deleted all his accounts. I haven't heard from him since. That night, my smart TV turned on by itself. No sound. Just a single image. The spiral, pulsing faintly in grayscale. I watched it for a second before forcing myself to look away. My eyes stung. My thoughts didn't feel like mine anymore. Mara finally said the name out loud. Project Decoy. She had found it buried in an old internal memo tied to a defunct research initiative labeled Behavioral Perceptual Engineering. The memo listed 3 private contractors, one of which was Delos Strategy Group. The language was clinical, emotionless. Symbolic architecture for long-term effective alignment. Emotive pattern inoculation across public visual environments. It didn't describe manipulation, it described integration, symbols embedded so widely, so subtly, that resistance became impossible because the mind never knew it had been breached. The deeper we looked, the clearer the structure became. It wasn't a single agency or firm, it was a network. Pharmaceutical companies, data brokers, advertising agencies, and defense subcontractors, all working under the same initiative. Different pieces of the same system. Mara traced one of the early studies back to a military psychological operations program from the late 1990s. It had used visual cues to increase civilian compliance during conflict zones. The symbols weren't experimental, they were operational. I started getting emails that disappeared as quickly as they arrived, subject lines that blinked and vanished. A friend in digital risk sent me a screenshot from a dark web forum discussing visual soft warfare vectors and cognitive overwrite thresholds. My name was in the thread, so was Mara's. That night, her home lab was broken into. Nothing stolen, nothing obvious, just the biometric readers on her test rigs fried, as if someone had come in just to erase her ability to prove anything. Then came the warning. A former creative director I hadn't spoken to in years called from a burner. He said he couldn't talk long. Told me to delete everything, wipe all my drives. "You're inside it now," he said. "The point of no return isn't when you notice the symbols. It's when they start noticing you." He hung up without saying goodbye. I did what I could. scrubbed what little I had, pulled the battery from my phone, disconnected everything. But it didn't matter. That night, the spiral appeared again, not on a screen, not in an app. Reflected in a puddle at the base of my building, drawn in oil and water, turning on its own. I left my apartment at 4 a.m., carrying only a duffel bag and a hard drive sealed in an anti-static pouch. No phone, no laptop, no digital trace. Mara had vanished 2 days earlier. Her building was locked down by unmarked security, her email wiped, and her name removed from every publication she'd ever written. It was like someone had rolled back her existence. I stayed in cheap motels, paid in cash, and avoided anything with a screen. But the spiral followed, etched into receipts, in the stitching of hotel curtains, hidden in the static of old TVs left on in lobbies. It wasn't just placement, it was saturation. I found an abandoned recording studio upstate, deep in a wooded area, built in the 70s and long since forgotten. It had no signal, no working power grid. I patched together a small generator and stripped the room of anything modern. The goal was clear: isolate my senses, cleanse my focus, break the loop. I set up blackout panels, removed reflective surfaces and covered every screen I'd brought with opaque film. Then I began what Mara had once called perceptual quarantine. The first 2 days passed in silence. No outside input, no visuals beyond the bare concrete walls. My thoughts slowed. I stopped seeing the spiral behind my eyelids. But then came the rebound. Nightmares, flash images of eyes inside shapes, dreams where entire cities pulsed with synchronized symbols, people walking in perfect rhythm, their gazes fixed on invisible points in space. I woke in a cold sweat more than once, unsure what was real. I spoke aloud just to hear my own voice. I sketched symbols I couldn't remember drawing, then burned the pages without reading them twice. On the 5th day, something shifted. I stopped reacting. My mind felt still for the first time in weeks. That's when I saw it. Not a spiral, not a pattern, a disruption, a counter-geometry, clean, inverted, designed to fracture the loop. It came not as an image, but a feeling, like seeing a mistake in a reflection. I redrew it, simple lines, precise angles. It didn't soothe, but it disrupted. That was enough. I knew then what I had to do. I wouldn't run. I'd fight back with design. Not to erase the signal, but to break its rhythm. The design wasn't art, it was a mechanism, lines calibrated to disrupt alignment, angles that pulled focus away from central fixation points. I refined it slowly, testing its effects on myself first. When I looked at the spiral after viewing the new shape, the hold broke. Not completely, but enough to reclaim thought. Enough to blink. That was all I needed. I built a small series of variations, each one tuned to fracture specific layouts, triangles for nested spirals, diagonals to cut radial symmetry, noise patterns to mute soft focus. Then I printed them in grayscale on adhesive transparencies and stuck them to corners of mirrors, device frames, and windows. I started small, a subway map near my old office, a QR sticker on the back of a pharmacy self-checkout kiosk, a children's book in a little free library, slipped between the pages like a misplaced illustration. I didn't leave notes or messages, just the symbols. I wanted them to be discovered accidentally. A moment of confusion, a glance that interrupted the loop. It wasn't about making people believe me. It was about shaking their focus even for a second. In time, I saw small changes. A teenager staring at a bus ad blinked, turned away. A man scrolling his phone paused when the shape flickered across the corner of his screen. One night, I passed a sidewalk projection cycling through brand slogans. My counter symbol had been chalked next to it by someone else. Crude, but recognizable. That's when I knew I wasn't alone. I kept moving. I changed locations weekly, never using the same print shop twice. I avoided cameras, paid in cash, wiped every drive I used. Still, I knew they were watching. The ads became sharper, the symbols more complex. But the spiral no longer worked on me. The fog had lifted. I could see the shapes forming before they were deployed, sense the design intent behind every billboard and interface. This wasn't a message war. It was a perceptual arms race. And I had become fluent in their language. Not to mirror it, but to fracture it. I no longer designed for clients. I designed for resistance, for interruption. Because the eye was never passive. It was the battlefield. They said Blue Drop would save the city. I didn't expect it to make everyone stop caring if it burned. 3 months ago, I was signing paperwork to approve Blue Drop installations in precinct water dispensers. A gift from Sectoron, the city liaison had called it, free purification systems for a water grid choking on lead and neglect. It looked like a miracle. Crime dropped by double digits, no protests for 6 straight weekends. My name's Elias Kaur, detective, 31 years old, and lately the only one in this city who seems to remember what unrest feels like. I'd gone entire shifts without a single emergency call. But the quiet was too perfect. I started noticing it first in suspects. Guys I'd booked for armed robbery were weeping during intake, apologizing to the victims, asking for forgiveness like it was a group therapy circle. And the victims, they barely reacted. One woman came home to find her husband murdered in the kitchen, and she just tidied around the body. Said she didn't want the mess to sit in her spirit. I didn't say anything at first. You don't file a report on weird vibes, you let it stew. But then came the Graves case, triple homicide, execution style. I pulled the confession myself, no hesitation. I feel at peace with my actions, he said, dead behind the eyes like he wasn't even in the room. I kept reviewing the footage of the interview, looking for cracks. There were none. Just that flat, patient serenity like he'd been coached by a grief counselor. I tried running top screens on him. Clean. No prior mental health history. So I started checking other cases, pulling logs, scanning security cams in my spare time. And the deeper I looked, the more the calm felt wrong, uniform, engineered. Like everyone was drinking this same thing. That's when I found the memo, buried in a civil contractor audit, flagged under proprietary chemical stabilization. The wording was vague, but the redactions were all wrong. Chemical classifications that looked more like SSRIs than mineral, filters. I'd seen mood regulators used before back in the army. We dosed village wells during pacification ops. That same cocktail of disorientation and contentment. We called it velvet fog. Now it had a new name, Blue Drop. I didn't plan to investigate Blue Drop. I thought I'd let it go, chalk it up to overwork and paranoia. But once you see it, you can't unsee it. At first, it was little things. A rookie at the precinct started humming the same 3-note tune every time she poured a glass of water. Officers stopped arguing over shift schedules. The tension that usually filled the locker room after a long day just vanished. Everyone smiled more, even when things went wrong. When Jenkins lost his daughter in a car crash, he came in the next morning with breakfast sandwiches for the whole squad. Said grief was a passing breeze. I wanted to believe it was healing. Progress. But something deeper itched beneath the surface. It wasn't natural. It was rehearsed, controlled. My gut told me the city wasn't calming down, it was being silenced. I kept quiet for another week, observing. I stopped drinking the tap water at work. Started bringing my own bottles from a spring upstate. After 2 days, I noticed the change. Colors seemed brighter. My heart beat faster. I got irritable. Over small things again. It felt good, like I'd been underwater and finally came up for air. That's when I knew something was wrong. Really wrong. I pulled water samples from 4 different blue drop stations and sent them to a contact at a private lab. 2 days later, he called me in a whisper. This isn't filtration, it's modulation. He found synthetic compounds in trace amounts, low enough to avoid public reporting thresholds, but active enough to affect neurochemistry. Dopamine regulators, serotonin enhancers, beta blockers. He didn't ask where I got the samples, he just told me to be careful. That night, I reviewed internal affairs reports going back 6 months. All misconduct cases had flatlined. No police, altercations, no excessive force complaints, not even late paperwork. It wasn't just the public, it was us. We were being softened too, shaped. The next morning, I confronted my partner, Lyra. She listened in silence. When I finished, she just smiled. A wide, placid smile I'd never seen on her before. "You need rest, Elias," she said. "You've been too tense lately." She reached for the faucet to refill her glass. I didn't stop her, but I watched, and that smile never broke. I stopped drinking anything I didn't bring myself. Bottled spring water, sealed containers only. It didn't take long for the symptoms to hit. The first night, I couldn't sleep. My body itched under the skin like something was trying to crawl out. My hands shook. By morning, my joints ached and my vision blurred around the edges. I kept telling myself it was just psychological, but by day 3 I knew it wasn't. I collapsed in my apartment bathroom, hit my head on the tile, and woke up hours later, drenched in sweat. I hadn't felt fear like that since the war. My heart pounded like it was trying to leave my chest. My mind raced through thoughts that didn't belong to me, images of smiling faces, flowing water, a blue light I couldn't place. I nearly gave in. I nearly turned on the tap. Instead, I called the lab contact again. His line was dead. No voicemail. No trace of his number in my call history. I checked my phone records and the call from 2 days earlier wasn't there. I drove to his office, a rented space in a low-rise outside city limits. The blinds were shut. Mail was piled at the door. The property manager told me it had been empty for over a year. I knew better than to push further. Someone had cleaned it out, wiped it like it never existed. That night I filled a bathtub with rainwater I'd been collecting in sealed drums. I sat in the dark and drank slowly, letting the cold, metallic taste settle on my tongue. It wasn't refreshing. It was raw, sharp, but it didn't fog my head. It didn't make me smile. I started seeing the difference everywhere. School kids moving in perfect single-file lines without being told. Couples breaking up quietly without emotion. Even the city birds seemed quieter, their calls strangely rhythmic. Something about the environment had shifted. It wasn't just the water, it was the atmosphere. As if the entire city was being tuned to a frequency just below awareness. And me, I was the static. I was off-key, and that meant someone would notice soon. 2 days after the blackout in my apartment, my precinct access card stopped working. No warning, no message from admin. I had to buzz in and wait while the desk sergeant looked me over like I was a stranger. When I asked about the change, he shrugged and said the system was under audit. Inside, my desk had been cleared. My files were gone. Even the nameplate had been removed. Lyra was nowhere in sight. A new detective sat at her station, typing with deliberate calm. When I asked about her, he looked up slowly and said, "She's on leave, health reasons." His tone made it clear the conversation was over. I didn't stay long. I told them I needed air and walked out without a destination. My hands were still shaking, but the clarity I felt was unnerving. Every detail stood out, the synchronized blinking of crosswalk lights, the way people seemed to stop walking at the exact moment a car passed. It wasn't coincidence. It was coordination, controlled rhythms, reinforced behavior. Whatever Blue Drop was doing, it wasn't subtle anymore. It was operating through more than just the water. I went home and powered up an old laptop I hadn't used in years. No wireless card, no smart features, just a basic terminal. I loaded a backup of precinct case files I'd saved off the grid weeks ago. Most of them were untouched, but embedded in the metadata of one video file, footage from a minor traffic incident, was a corrupted data block. I ran a basic hex scan. What I found wasn't standard code. It was a string of structured pulses too regular to be an error. 16 character bursts, repeated with minor shifts like a waveform or a trigger. It reminded me of something I'd seen during a training op overseas, a signal used to sync behavior in crowd control experiments. At the time, it had been dismissed as unreliable, but this was different. This was stable, polished, mass-deployed. And it wasn't just embedded in video, it was in body cams, dash cams, even the radio logs. Blue Drop wasn't just modifying water, it was embedding reinforcement signals across the entire city grid. And somehow, I had tripped the alarm. By the end of the week, I knew I was being watched. It wasn't paranoia anymore. It was confirmed. My car's dash cam, which I'd rigged to a private drive, picked up a city utility van parked across the street 3 nights in a row. Same van, same angle, no work being done. I ran the plates, registered to a dummy contractor tied to Sectorons. Logistics branch, the same group behind Blue Drop's installation. The next morning, I found my front door unlocked. Nothing stolen, no damage, just a faint scent of disinfectant in the hallway and a smiley face sticker on the inside of the bathroom mirror. It hadn't been there the day before. I went underground, packed a go bag, wiped my devices, and drove until the city lights disappeared behind me. I didn't go far, just enough to feel the static ease from my skin. I slept in the car near a transmission tower I remembered from patrol routes. Dead zone, no signal, no coverage. I started sketching the patterns I'd seen in the data bursts, overlaying them with the timestamps from body cam feeds. They formed sequences, not random, instructional, like a digital catechism. I didn't fully understand the purpose, but it became clear these weren't just reinforcements, they were maintenance pulses, keeping people inside a behavioral envelope. When the pulses dropped below a certain threshold, aggression returned. When synced, the subject smiled. It explained why people weren't angry anymore, why grief was flattened, protests vanished, even road rage had become rare. The city had become emotionally soundproofed. I reached out to a contact from an old surveillance unit, someone I trusted from before any of this began. I sent a low-band, encrypted message through a courier dead drop. 3 hours later, I got a reply. Stop digging. They're embedding triggers in sensory media, even text, no name, no sign-off. That night, I dreamed of water. Endless, calm surfaces and faces just beneath, smiling still and waiting. When I woke up, my face hurt from clenching. I checked the mirror in my visor. My mouth was stretched into a grin I didn't remember making. I couldn't go back, not to my apartment, not to the precinct, not even to the neighborhoods I once patrolled. Every place I knew was part of the network now, clean, compliant, and humming with something I could no longer ignore. I stayed in motion, changing cars twice using only cash. I slept in rest stops and abandoned buildings, never in the same spot twice. The rainwater I'd collected was running low, so I tracked a fringe group I'd heard whispers about months earlier, off-grid types who didn't trust municipal systems. Back then, they were dismissed as cranks. Now, they were the only ones making sense. They called themselves the Dry Minds. I found them beneath an old shipping yard near the river, living off battery power and boiled rainwater. No phones, no digital gear, just faces etched with tension and eyes that moved too fast. I was brought in blindfolded, interrogated, and scanned for subtle facial cues, rhythms and expressions that might mark me as synced. Once I passed, they let me see the archive. Dozens of stolen files, leaked memos, and corrupted chemical profiles. Most of it was fragmented, but the pattern was clear. Blue Drop wasn't civilian tech. It was an adaptation, stripped down from something originally deployed by defense contractors during foreign occupation zones. A neurochemical firewall to make hostile populations docile. The filters weren't just removing contaminants, they were adding a proprietary blend of emotional dampeners calibrated by behavioral feedback loops. Each neighborhood's water had its own formula, adjusted daily based on crime rates, civil unrest data, and even social media sentiment. If a district got too loud, the dose increased. If it stayed calm, the system coasted. Perfect feedback, total compliance. One of the Dry Minds, a former biochemist, showed me a map. Red zones marked desync potential. Ours was the last one left. All others were under full modulation. When I asked what happened to those who resisted, she pointed to a stack of sealed tapes marked failed nodes. No one spoke about them. Not out loud. I didn't need to ask. I'd seen enough to understand. This wasn't a city anymore. It was a behavioral lattice, quiet, controlled, and almost complete. I thought exposing it would change everything. I believed, for a moment, that if people saw what I'd seen, they'd wake up. So I broke into the Blue Drop mainframe from a relay server buried behind 4 layers of spoofed IPs and stolen credentials. It wasn't easy. The system had safeguards designed to crash intrusions before they reached core storage. But I didn't need everything. Just one file. The original. Formulation logs. I decrypted and dumped them onto a secure archive, then sent them to every outlet I could find. Local news, independent watchdogs, foreign press. And I waited. Nothing happened. No headlines, no protests, not even a whisper. A week passed, and the city didn't flinch. The report sat unread, buried under distractions, sports scores, celebrity gossip, weather updates. I watched the download tracker stall at 14. 2 of those were mine. The others? Maybe bots, maybe worse. I went back to the Dry Minds to regroup, but the space was empty, evacuated, scorched in places, no sign of struggle, but nothing left. Behind. Not even a note. I checked the rain drums they used, tipped, drained. I spent the next 2 nights alone, camped under a bypass with my last bottle of untainted water. I didn't sleep. Couldn't. My mind kept looping through memories that didn't line up. A partner I barely remembered, cases that felt too clean. Whole chunks of my past faded like bleached paper. I started to wonder how much of me was still mine. On the 3rd day, I saw movement near the train yard, a small group moving fast. They didn't speak in full sentences, just clipped bursts, quiet and urgent. I followed from a distance, careful not to be seen. Eventually, one of them looked back. He didn't seem alarmed, just nodded. Like he recognized something in me. Like I belonged. Now I live beneath the grid, drinking rain, speaking in fragments, rebuilding memory from scraps. We don't talk about fixing the city anymore. It doesn't want to be fixed. The calm is too deep, too comfortable, but we remember. That's all we can do now. And sometimes remembering is enough. Not peace, not freedom, just the truth, held tight like a fading ember. They say once you notice a pattern, you can't unsee it. For me, it started with a tone, a pulse, buried so deep in the mix, I thought my ears were playing tricks on me. Max Calder didn't sleep much anymore. The tinnitus had seen to that. It came in waves, high, soft whines that dipped and rose like whispers underwater. After years spent mastering audio for commercials no one remembered, Max had learned to live with the hum, tuning it out like traffic or memory. He worked from a small apartment in a part of the city that had once been lively, now just quiet enough to feel empty. Most days he edited background tracks for B-tier podcasts and niche YouTube channels. It was boring work, but predictable, until he picked up a job from a popular political podcast. Top 10 on every chart, funded by some think tank, Max didn't bother Googling. The host's voice was clean, confident, the kind that made you nod along without knowing why. But underneath it, Max caught something strange. A low oscillation, not quite audible, but felt like pressure. He soloed the vocal track, pulled down the EQ, filtered it through a spectral analyzer. There it was again, a subharmonic tone cycling every 23 seconds. It didn't belong. At first, he blamed the file. Maybe a dirty preamp or a botched compression pass. But the signal was too clean, the timing too precise. He let it go. Until the next week, on a completely different show, he heard it again. Same tone, same 23-second rhythm, no overlap in networks, different producers, different hosts, still there. That was when the itch started. Max began downloading episodes of other top-ranked podcasts, left-wing, right-wing, self-help, wellness, tech. He stripped the vocals, passed the frequencies, and found it repeating, always the same, hidden just beneath the threshold of awareness, a ghost in the mix. He stayed up 3 nights in a row mapping it, a pattern clear as daylight if you knew where to look. Something was being transmitted, engineered. Whatever it wasn't accidental, and once he saw it, he couldn't stop. That night, Max sat in the dark with his headphones on, listening to the world talk. But all he could hear was the tone. Max started logging every instance of the tone. He built a spreadsheet, marked timestamps, decibel levels, modulation curves. What disturbed him wasn't just how widespread it was how calculated. Each pulse aligned perfectly with emotionally charged language, fear, outrage, reassurance. Moments designed to anchor trust or provoke reaction. He pulled EEG datasets from public studies on listener engagement. Most showed normal fluctuations in attention, but when he overlaid the tone markers, patterns emerged. Listener brainwave activity shifted subtly but consistently after exposure. It wasn't dramatic, but it was there. Measurable dips in critical processing, mirrored by spikes in emotional compliance. He wasn't imagining it. The tone wasn't background noise, it was a lever. The more he found, the harder it became to ignore. He tracked a dozen podcast episodes across different platforms. Each contained the same pattern, embedded just below conscious hearing. When he ran the tones through a binaural beat simulator, he discovered something chilling. They synced with the theta frequency range, the band most associated with suggestibility and passive learning. Max tested it on himself. He played a clean clip of a podcast with the tone isolated, eyes closed, no distractions. Within minutes, he felt a kind of mental fog, not fatigue, just quiet. His thoughts slowed, skepticism dulled. He wasn't zoning out. He was accepting. The sensation passed after a while, but the effect stayed with him. He felt emptied, like part of him had been quieted without his consent. That night, he couldn't bring himself to edit another show. He sat staring at his waveform display, watching the cycle repeat every 23 seconds like clockwork, like breath. He called an old friend from his engineering days, someone who worked in neural interface design. "Is it possible," Max asked, "to influence thought with subharmonic audio?" The friend laughed. "Possible, that's old tech. The military ran tests in the 90s. If you want real influence, you hide it in something people trust." Max hung up. He already knew the answer. The next morning, he removed all smart devices from his apartment, turned off Wi-Fi, replaced his speakers with analog monitors, but it was too late. The tone had already nested in his mind. Max's world shrank fast. He stopped answering calls, let emails pile up. Every moment not spent analyzing audio was spent unplugging from the world that fed it. He taped over camera lenses, lined his laptop case with lead foil, and installed analog switches to kill power to every outlet in his apartment. He even stopped going outside during peak hours. At first, it felt like paranoia, but the more he looked, the more consistent the pattern became. Podcasts, streaming videos, political speeches, any content with large reach carried the signature. Different frequencies, same intervals, always embedded beneath key emotional cues. It was coordinated. One night, Max accessed an open dataset of podcast listener metrics. Buried in the engagement graphs, he saw it. Audience retention surged. In the minutes following, tone exposure. Not just retention. Sentiment analysis showed a drop in skeptical or contradictory comments, replaced by vague affirmations and passive agreement. Whatever this was, it worked. And no one seemed to notice. That's when he contacted Lena. She'd been his ex, a sharp political journalist with a nose for manufactured narratives. They hadn't spoken in over a year, but she always listened. To evidence, he sent her a sample, 2 identical podcast segments, one with the tone stripped out, one left intact. A few hours later, she called him back. "You need help, Max," she said. "There's nothing in these files." He froze. She wasn't angry, just calm. Too calm, detached. "It's okay to take a break from this stuff. You always overanalyze." Her words felt scripted. Max asked her to meet in person. She declined, said she was too busy, then ended the call without waiting for his reply. He sat in silence for a long time after that, staring at the waveform still pulsing on his screen. The conversation hadn't felt real. It felt like she was reading from something, or being read through. That night, Max began recording a long-form breakdown of everything he'd found. He called it an audio manifesto, layering it with high-frequency countertones he believed could disrupt the signal. As he spoke, he felt a strange resistance, not from outside, but inside. Thoughts dulled, words twisted. He had to fight for every sentence. Whatever this was, it was already working through him. Max stopped trusting digital storage. Hard drives vanished from his desk only to reappear blank. Cloud backups failed without explanation. Uploads stalled, crashed, or disappeared the moment they finished. He watched one video clip disappear from a public hosting site just seconds after it went live. No copyright strike, no takedown notice, just gone. Shadow banned. That was the term now, but this felt different. Not a flagging algorithm. Erasure. As if something had already anticipated every move he would make. He switched to offline tools, cassette recorders, magnetic tape, physical notes, no syncs, no connections. He used a second-hand laptop air-gapped from any network, powered by a car battery. Each night, he recorded more of his findings, layering them with waveforms that opposed the 23-second tone, oscillating in imperfect patterns to confuse its rhythm. But his voice sounded off. Each playback introduced a subtle distortion. Words clipped, frequencies flattened. At first, he thought it was the equipment. Then he heard it, his own voice, sampled, spliced, and altered on a new podcast episode under a title he'd never heard, Anti-Conspiracy Wellness for Modern Thinkers. The host's voice was synthetic, like a voice model trained on thousands of hours of speech. But there was no mistaking the cadence. It was him. They hadn't just silenced him, they'd absorbed him, made him into part of the mechanism, a controlled opposition. Carefully branded, calmly dismissive, his manifesto, remixed and stripped of content, now promoted media literacy through passive reflection. The irony was suffocating. He sat in the dark, headset on, replaying the episode again and again. Not a trace of the truth remained, just reassurance. A voice urging listeners to let go of tension and trust their curated spaces. The tones were still there, now louder, more refined. The cycle had become smoother, more seamless, a perfect blend of comfort and compliance. That was the moment Max stopped trying to publish. He began trying to interrupt. The system couldn't be out-argued, but it could be distorted. His plan was simple. Hijack a major live broadcast and inject a counterwave, something raw, unfiltered. A harmonic rupture designed to jar listeners awake, even if just for a moment. The truth didn't need to convince, it only had to interrupt. Max chose the target carefully. A live-streamed podcast with millions of viewers known for its smooth production and surgically timed emotional pacing. It wasn't political, at least not openly. It sold lifestyle, confidence, belonging. The perfect vehicle for the tone. He spent days studying the show's streaming infrastructure, server paths, routing protocols, authentication handshakes. Most of it was off-the-shelf software wrapped in custom branding. But there was one weakness, a legacy encoder still using open RTMP ports. It wouldn't last. Someone would patch it. But for now, it was a door. Max built a relay in an abandoned signal box on the rooftop of a shuttered office building, shielded with copper mesh and insulated from outside interference. No cell signal, no Wi-Fi, just hard lines and analog tools. The counterwave file was short, 31 seconds, just outside the rhythm of the embedded tone. It started with silence, then escalated into a raw, uneven pulse. Max had designed it to hit the auditory system like static, breaking through a lullaby. It didn't say anything. It didn't need to. At 9:03 p.m., the podcast's intro music played. The chat filled with floating hearts and clapping emojis. Max waited until the second tone cycle passed, then launched the relay. His file injected mid-sentence. The host's voice stuttered, then dropped out completely. The tone collapsed into feedback. For 7 seconds, silence. Then the counterwave. Static, low and arrhythmic, pulsing in unpredictable bursts. A pause. A cold, fragmented version of Max's voice. You're not thinking your own thoughts.
Viewers froze, comments stopped, the stream hung in suspension, buffering.
Then everything resumed as if nothing had happened. The host reappeared mid-word, smiling, unaware. The chat picked back up, but something had shifted. Dozens of users posted confused reactions. Others claimed memory glitches, lost time, headaches, déjà vu. One comment stood out. I heard something. I don't know what it was, but I can't stop thinking about it. Max disconnected the relay, wiped the drives and vanished from the building before anyone could trace the spike. He didn't celebrate. He didn't speak. But for the first time in weeks, he slept without headphones. Something had cracked. Not broken, not yet, but cracked, wide enough to let something else in. Doubt. The next morning, Max woke to silence. No notifications, no alerts, not even system logs. He checked his offline devices first. Still intact, the relay file was gone.
As expected. But something else was missing, his local recordings. Not deleted, just blank.
Empty containers with the correct timestamps, but no data inside. It was like someone had erased content without touching the file structure. He opened his terminal, ran checksum scans. The hashes matched. The files hadn't been tampered with. They had been constructed to appear real while holding nothing. Max stared at the screen, blinking. It wasn't just censorship. It was camouflage, a false memory written in code. Outside, the street was unusually quiet. The city still moved, but everything felt muted, subtle signs of interference. The air lacked its usual undercurrent of noise. Conversations sounded slower, less layered. Max walked to the corner cafe, a place where old habits still lingered. The barista smiled, made eye contact, asked if he wanted the usual. But her voice had a softness to it, as if modulated for comfort. He paid in cash. On the wall-mounted screen above her, the podcast he had hijacked played in looped highlights. None mentioned the interruption. A guest on the show smiled brightly and spoke about the importance of mental harmony in turbulent times. Max sat by the window and sipped his coffee, scanning faces. Every interaction around him looked normal, polite, efficient, empty. No tension, no real discussion, even disagreement sounded agreeable. A man at a nearby table stared blankly at a tablet, nodding at nothing. Max stood and walked out without finishing his drink. Back in his apartment, he checked darknet forums. Someone had posted a file named Echo Chamber V0. No origin, no description. Just a 7-second clip, his counterwave, distorted and compressed. It had already been downloaded thousands of times. He didn't upload it, but someone had. The ripple was spreading. That night, Max watched listener graphs from independent platforms, tiny dips in loyalty curves, slight increases in unsubscribe.
Rates. Comments returning with real questions. The change wasn't loud. It was subtle, like rust under paint. And Max understood then he didn't need to win. He only needed to make people look twice. Max didn't wait for them to find him.
By the end of the week, his apartment was stripped bare. No cables, no screens, no traceable signals. He left behind nothing but a disconnected wall outlet and a layer of dust. It wasn't fear driving him now, it was clarity. He had seen what the signal could do, but more importantly, what a fracture in that signal could spark. It wasn't about convincing the masses, it was about disrupting the pattern just long enough for someone to notice the quiet. He travelled light, using train stations and cash-only motels, places where algorithms didn't monitor every movement. In cities where no one knew his face, he listened. Not for the tone, but for its absence. And sometimes, in those gaps, he heard something else. Static. Uneven phrases. A kind of mirrored response. The counterwave hadn't just disrupted the pattern, it had seeded something new. Across niche forums and encrypted channels, people were posting strange fragments, offbeat recordings, altered speech, files labeled only with coordinates or times. Max recognized the structure. These weren't copies. They were mutations. Independent signals growing from the same break in the rhythm. Somewhere out there, others had heard it too. His voice, borrowed, twisted, erased, had become background noise. But the moment of silence he created had survived, not as a warning, but as proof that something existed beneath the noise, that thought, real thought, was still possible. The last file he created wasn't broadcast or uploaded. It was burned to a single CD, then mailed, no return address, no signature, to a list of independent producers he knew would listen. It ended with just one phrase, clear and unprocessed. Enlightenment doesn't come with answers, only with the awareness that something has shaped your thinking and the courage to stop listening. Max was never heard from again, but echo chamber V0 kept circulating, passed from inbox to inbox, embedded in anonymous playlists, whispered about on quiet forums, and somewhere someone always noticed the pattern, a hesitation, a flicker, a moment when the voice in their ears didn't sound like their own. That was all it took, one crack, one doubt, and the signal could never fully recover. The first time Mara heard the phrase "you already know," it barely registered, but by the 10th time in a single speech, it chilled her. The university auditorium was colder than usual, but Dr. Mara Elkin barely noticed. Her fingers moved absently across the printed speech, red pen hovering, mind distant. She wasn't new to this. Political language had its rhythms, its tics. She'd spent her career dissecting them. But something about this draft made her pause. "You already know," it repeated. Then, "It just makes sense." And again, halfway down the second page, "Let me tell you a secret." These weren't just turns of phrase. They were signals. Familiar, almost hypnotic in their cadence. Her brow furrowed. This wasn't the work of the candidate. He was sharp, but not strategic like this. Someone else had touched this. Someone who understood.
More than just persuasion. She circled the phrases, then set the paper aside. It nagged at her.
That night, after a lecture on semiotic drift in political discourse, Mara stayed late in her office. She opened her archive, pulled a few debate transcripts from recent years, scanned for the same patterns. They were there. Not word for word, but the same scaffolding, certain cues placed like scaffolds for the brain, bypassing reason and slipping through the side door of the mind. Her curiosity sharpened. Over the next few days, she expanded her search. Left, right, independent. It didn't matter. They were all using it. The same linguistic fingerprint, scattered across ideologies, woven into speeches by people who never should have had the same playbook. She cross-referenced her findings with public data from audience response studies, heart rate, galvanic skin response, attention drift metrics. The match was clear. These phrases didn't just sound good. They worked. They disarmed. They aligned. They controlled. Mara leaned back in her chair, the glow of her monitor casting long shadows across the bookshelves behind her. She'd stumbled into something real. Something designed. And it was everywhere. A rising tension stirred beneath the surface of her calm. This wasn't style, it was strategy, systematic, intentional. And she had the receipts. Mara didn't speak of her findings at first. She wasn't sure how to frame them. To colleagues, they would sound like idle paranoia, a conspiracy, woven from coincidence. But the more she looked, the harder it became to dismiss. At home, she pulled footage from televised debates, campaign ads, even viral town hall moments. She mapped the trigger phrases and tracked biometric overlays where available. The pattern only deepened. These phrases were more than persuasive. They had physiological effects. Viewers leaned forward when they heard them, heart rates synchronized, faces softened. In post-event surveys, those exposed to the phrases rated the speaker as more trustworthy, even when their positions were vague. She bookmarked everything, saved offline copies, catalogued source trails. What began as curiosity had become obsession. Late one night, as the rain tapped against her office window, she stumbled on a consulting firm listed discreetly in the metadata of a leaked campaign draft. The name meant nothing. Ortolan Strategies. No website, no press, no client list. But when she ran the name through academic paper citations, something lit up. Contributors on behavioral economics papers, military psychological operations manuals, even a few co-authors from DARPA-funded linguistics experiments. Mara's pulse quickened. She wasn't chasing a theory anymore. She was tracing a line, one, that curved behind the public face of politics and into a darker architecture. Buried in an archived campaign memo, wedged between logistics notes, she found a line that confirmed her worst suspicion. Segment 3, Linguistic Anchors, reviewed by Drift Cell, insert "You already know" post-statement. It was color-coded, initialed, and slipped into the margins like a formatting note. Not a rhetorical flourish, but an instruction. Speech wasn't being written, it was being engineered. She printed everything. The desk filled with annotated pages and scribbled diagrams. Phrases became nodes, arrows formed connections. The image looked less like a theory and more like a map. And then her screen blinked. A login error. When she refreshed, her access to the university speech database was denied. 2 folders vanished from her shared drive. A scheduled meeting with her graduate assistant disappeared from the calendar. She called his phone, disconnected. She tried the campus records. His name was still listed, but his advisor was no longer her. Mara sat still, the hum of the building's lights suddenly too loud. A line had been crossed, but she wasn't sure which one. The work was no longer just observation. She had become a variable, and someone had noticed. 3 days passed before Mara received the first visit. A polite man in a tailored suit introduced himself as Robert from the Civic Futures Institute, a think tank she had never heard of. He praised her research, her clarity of thought, her unique perspective on language. Then he asked about her recent work. Not directly, he danced around it with vague compliments about innovative correlations and the ethics of persuasive architecture. Mara gave nothing away. He left a business card with no email, no address, just a phone number and a logo she couldn't place. The next day, a woman from the Institute for Strategic Communication reached out to schedule an informal round table. Same tone, same language, different face. The third message came through her department head. He forwarded an invitation from a national media literacy board, urging Mara to consider a role advising on curriculum development. She declined them all. That week, her upcoming conference keynote was reassigned without explanation. A journal she'd submitted 2 months ago suddenly rejected her paper, citing unverifiable sources despite her detailed citations. When she checked the archive for the biometric data studies she had been using, the files returned blank pages. Her access permissions had quietly changed. No warning, no appeal. At first, Mara assumed internal politics. Academia had its frictions. But then the blog post appeared. Anonymous, accusatory, a smear cloaked in the language of concern. It quoted her out of context, framing her as a promoter of fringe theories. The author called her work dangerously suggestive, a threat to democratic discourse. The post spread fast. It was shared by pundits on both sides, some mocking, others condemning. The comments were worse. Her inbox flooded with messages, some supportive, most not. At a faculty meeting, no one mentioned the post, but the silence was deliberate, the kind that settled in a room like smoke. That night, Mara sat at her kitchen table in the dark, the hum of the refrigerator louder than it should have been. She didn't check the locks, though she thought about it. Not because she felt unsafe, but because she was beginning to understand the shape of what was happening. This wasn't chaos, it was containment. Mara waited until she was sure the trail was cold. She moved through the city differently now. No routine, no fixed paths. She paid in cash. She left her phone at home. When she finally reached out to the journalist, she used a burner laptop in the corner of a late-night copy shop. The journalist's name was Reed Nolan, a quiet figure on the fringe of major outlets. Known for restraint, not theatrics. He answered her message within the hour. They met in a parking structure, 4th level mid-morning, public enough to avoid suspicion, empty enough to feel exposed. She handed him a folder. No USBs, no passwords, just printed pages, metadata correlations, biometric overlays, anonymized, consulting invoices. She watched him flip through it, his eyes narrowing but never widening. He didn't ask questions, just nodded, tucked the folder into his coat, and said he'd be in touch. Mara walked away without looking back. 2 days later, Reed published a short article, measured, cautious. He didn't name her, he didn't mention the full pattern, but he raised the core idea: coordinated speech manipulation, engineered language, triggers, and a quiet consulting network behind multiple campaigns. He framed it as a question, not a claim. The piece didn't go viral, but it reached the right circles: data journalists, researchers, private intelligence analysts. Enough to rattle the surface. On the 3rd day, Reed died in a single-car accident on a residential street he knew well. The police report cited brake failure. The car was incinerated before first responders arrived. Mara watched the news from a motel room outside the city, her laptop balanced on her knees. The headline was small, local. His name already slipping from search trends. She didn't cry, not because she wasn't afraid, but because fear had given way to something quieter. The message was clear. This wasn't a warning. It was a correction, a reset. Her phone buzzed once. Unknown number, no voicemail. She threw it in the sink and turned the faucet. As the screen cracked under the water, she felt the last strand of her old life snap loose. She was no longer trying to reveal anything. She was trying to survive. Mara didn't leave the motel for 6 days. She stayed off the grid. No internet, no phone, no traceable purchases. She rotated through disguises. Ball cap, dyed hair, a limp she didn't need but wore anyway. At night, she scanned news feeds in public libraries using guest terminals. Reed's article was gone. Not retracted, removed. The outlet issued a vague correction about data inconsistencies. His name was absent from follow-ups. No public funeral. No memorial. It was as if he had never existed. When Mara tried to contact the last few researchers she trusted, their responses were clipped or non-existent. One politely asked her not to write again. Another email bounced back with a permanent delivery failure. She wasn't just isolated, she had been erased. The pressure built quietly. First came a letter from the university, formal and oddly apologetic. Her research was under review. Her teaching contract was paused. A compliance inquiry was opened with no specified allegations. Then came a call from a media outlet requesting an on-record comment about the increasingly controversial claims she'd been linked to online. The same phrases echoed through each call and message: irresponsible, anti-democratic, potentially harmful. The language she had studied so closely was now being turned on her. It was precise, deliberate, emotionally loaded, exactly the type of phrasing that bypassed doubt and seeded public certainty. A senior administrator called late one night, his voice tense. He advised her to consider the long-term impact of continued speculation. He used the word career 3 times in the space of 2 minutes. Mara thanked him and hung up. The next morning, she received a subpoena. She knew it wasn't about prosecution. It was pressure, a box around her. By the time she sat for the interview, she was hollowed out. The anchor opened with a smile, the kind designed to seem harmless. They asked about her background, her recent work, and finally, whether she stood by her theories. Mara stared into the camera and chose her words carefully. I followed the data as far as it could take me. Some of the conclusions were premature. Others lacked context. The anchor nodded, sensing submission. But Mara's voice remained level. It's a complicated field. I should have framed things more cautiously. It wasn't an apology. It was survival. The segment ended, but just before the camera cut away, her eyes caught the lens. For the briefest second she let the truth show. Not defiance, clarity. The fight was paused. The work wasn't. After the interview aired, Mara vanished. Not publicly, no headlines, no missing person report. She simply stopped appearing where people expected her. Her apartment lease ended early. Her bank accounts closed in sequence. Her academic credentials remained, but her name stopped circulating in professional spaces. Colleagues referred to her in past tense. Students who had once followed her work found broken links and expired pages. It was as if the academic world had quietly agreed she had said too much, then nothing at all. In truth, Mara was still working, just not under her own name. She moved through small towns and back roads, living in cash-only rentals and hostels, storing everything on encrypted drives that never left her sight. She stopped trying to expose the conspiracy. That part was over. What she needed now was distance, enough to build something without interference, something that couldn't be traced to her. It took months of silence before the idea took shape. The research couldn't be published. It had to be useful, practical, anonymous. She began developing a tool, a simple open-source program that could scan speech transcripts for manipulation markers, not just trigger phrases, but their arrangement, tone shifts, embedded suggestion loops. She trained the algorithm using her archived notes, speech cadences from televised debates, and biometric datasets she had saved before losing access. No branding, no login, no tracking, just a single tool uploaded under a pseudonym, ME, the Subtext Analyzer. It spread quietly at first. Reddit threads, private forums, a footnote in a digital literacy workshop. Then a video surfaced showing a user dissecting a viral campaign ad, exposing how trust cues were layered beneath policy language. The video was shared, then reposted, then cited. Activists used it, journalists borrowed it, political strategists began altering their phrasing. The software didn't cause outrage, it caused doubt. Viewers stopped asking only what was being said. They started asking how. The message wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was quiet, intentional, unbranded, and untraceable. And as the tool spread, Mara watched from a distance, unseen. Her voice had been erased, but her work was now everywhere. She had no face, no title, no credit, just reach. The tool did not spark revolution. It did something quieter, more lasting. It shifted attention. Subtle patterns began to fracture. Debate audiences grew less reactive. Focus groups stalled when tested with scripted rhetoric. Political consultants, those still using the old methods, found their cues falling flat. The algorithms had been built for a passive audience. Now the audience was listening differently. Something had changed. News anchors started pausing between phrases they once delivered without thought. Campaign staffers began rewriting speeches, testing phrasing against anonymous online tools that reported manipulative density in percentages. Some denied the tool's accuracy, others called it dangerous, but none could ignore it. In classrooms and public forums, young voters quoted speech patterns instead of slogans. They compared transcripts. They asked questions that once went unspoken. Why did he say that like a fact? Why does that line feel familiar? In focus groups, consultants logged rising numbers under a new category, linguistic fatigue. The signals were no longer landing. People were building tolerance. A quiet awareness took root, not trust in one narrative, but suspicion of all. The subtext. Analyzer had no update logs, no listed maintainer. Every attempt to trace its source led nowhere. It functioned across systems, accepted every format, flagged no malware. And at the bottom of every page, barely visible, were two characters. M.E. Mara watched this unfold from borrowed rooms and half-lit cafes. She kept no copies of the software. She didn't need to. The code was clean, small enough to fit on a flash drive, wide enough to fit into the culture. She had no interest in reclaiming her name. That name belonged to someone else now, someone who had taught language, who had trusted institutions, who had believed exposure would be enough. What mattered now was what came after. Not a scandal, not a takedown, something harder to erase. Awareness. The system would adapt, of course.
New methods, new phrasing. The cycle would try to reset, but it would never again be invisible, because Mara hadn't given them a threat. She had given people a lens, and once people saw the seams, they never stopped looking.
The first time Ava heard the new Inner Lumen track, it felt like silence had a shape, and that shape was wrong. She hadn't intended to listen. A friend had sent her the link late at night with a message. "This one's next level." She clicked, out of politeness, half listening as she folded laundry in her dim studio apartment. The voiceover was familiar, warm, female, soothing. But something didn't sit right. It wasn't the voice itself or even the ambient tones layered behind it. It was the way the air between phrases felt compressed, like a space that had been filled and scrubbed clean. At first, she brushed it off. Overproduction, maybe. But by the end of the 10-minute meditation, her scalp was tingling, and her heart felt like it had missed a step. That night, she couldn't sleep. She lay awake, the synthetic stillness of the track echoing in her memory. Ava had written code for Inner Lumen for nearly 4 years, optimizing everything from stream sync to biometric resonance triggers. She'd left the company a year ago, quietly, after an executive retreat where things started to feel off. No drama, no lawsuit, just a growing sense of disconnection. Since then, she'd kept her distance from anything Inner Lumen related, until now. By 2 a.m., she was wide awake at her desk, headphones on, spectrogram software open. She loaded the meditation file into the analyzer and waited. At first, the waveform looked normal, frequency curves aligned with expected audio patterns. But then she isolated the sub-bass. Her stomach turned. Beneath the main track, tucked below the threshold of conscious hearing, were vocal patterns. Short loops, almost inaudible. She adjusted the gain and slowed the speed. "You are safe."
Let go of doubt. The system protects you. Ava sat perfectly still.
These weren't standard affirmations. They weren't part of any published script. They were buried deep in the spectrum, just enough to slip past conscious processing. Her throat tightened. She rewound the file, ran a comparison against a meditation from a year ago. Nothing. No layers. No subliminal phrasing. It had started after she left. And now, for some reason, it had found its way back to her. Ava didn't sleep. By morning, the hum of traffic outside her window sounded distant, unreal. She replayed the meditation on a loop through different filters, running it through every tool she still had access to. Each pass confirmed the same thing. The hidden phrases weren't random. They were spaced at exact intervals, nested in frequencies designed to bypass conscious resistance. It wasn't just subliminal, it was engineered. She pulled up archived versions from her time at Innerlumen, digging into open-source mirrors and forgotten repositories. Early builds were clean, transparent. But the first altered file appeared 6 months after Innerlumen announced its Series D funding, a deal Ava remembered only vaguely, mostly because of how quickly it closed. The investors had remained anonymous, represented only by a shell firm with ties to a defense consultancy. At the time, no one cared. Mental health was booming. The app had hit 30 million users and was onboarding entire corporate clients, teachers, nurses, cops, anyone showing signs of burnout. Ava's stomach turned as she read user reviews from the last 6 months. Calmer than ever. I don't stress like I used to. Finally stopped questioning everything. She'd skimmed those before, chalked them up to marketing fluff. But now, each phrase felt like a confession. Ava shut her laptop and walked to the window. Across the street, a delivery van idled too long at the curb. She stared until it moved on. Her phone buzzed, a message from her friend, the one who'd sent the track. You listened to it yet? Wild how effective it is, right? Been playing it all week? Ava didn't reply. She just turned off her Wi-Fi and packed a bag. Something had shifted in her, not just fear, but a numbness creeping around her edges. She noticed how her thoughts seemed slower, her emotions flattened. She'd been careful since quitting, offline most of the time, careful with what she used. But the file had made it through, and if she'd been flagged, through audio telemetry, through breath pacing, even micro delays in her playback behavior, they would know. Ava shut down every device in her apartment and left through the side stairwell. She couldn't explain it, but she felt watched. Not through cameras or people, through patterns, through silence. Ava checked into a short-term rental under a different name. No devices, no smart assistants, just a prepaid phone she'd bought at a gas station 3 towns over. The unit was clean but impersonal, neutral furniture, beige walls, no art. It suited her. That night, she lay on the floor with headphones on, listening to an older Innerlumen meditation from before the funding shift. No hidden layers, just silence, breath, and the faint rustle of wind chime ambience. She let it loop, not for peace, but to compare. Her mind drifted between memories of late-night bug fixes and ethics debates in team chats. They used to care about user trust. Every line of code had to be justifiable. That was the culture before the acquisition. Afterward, things changed. Leadership stopped answering questions. Ava left quietly, but others stayed. Some were too invested. Some were afraid. The next day, she called Leo, an old colleague who'd helped build the core of Innerlumen's audio engine. He didn't answer, but an hour later she got a message from an unlisted number. Meet in person. No phones. Use the back lot behind the old co-op. 9 p.m. She memorized the address, then destroyed the phone. At night, she walked. The co-op building had closed months ago, another casualty of rising rents. In the back lot, Leo waited in a hoodie and glasses, looking thinner than she remembered. He spoke without greeting. "You heard it too?" Ava nodded. He looked around, then opened his backpack. Inside was a laptop wrapped in anti-static sheeting. "I kept a dev build from before everything got locked down. I shouldn't have it, but I knew I'd need it someday." Ava hesitated. "You still running it?" He shook his head. "Off-grid only. Haven't synced to their network in over a year." They sat in the dark, surrounded by dumpsters and chain-link fencing, while Leo showed her the version logs. The changes started right after the funding closed, build 4.8.2. A new layer added to every track. Not in the script, not in the versions.
Notes, just labelled emotional reinforcement layer. Leo tapped the screen. They embedded it deep, adaptive phrasing. Tailored based on playback speed, breath cadence, even blink frequency if you use the front camera. Ava swallowed hard. Leo looked at her. "And if you skip the track too often, it flags you." She didn't ask what happened after that.
She already knew. Ava left the meeting with Leo more certain than ever. This wasn't just manipulation, it was system-level behavioral control. She returned to the rental and reviewed the dev logs he'd copied for her. Buried inside the audio pipeline was an undocumented module labeled Sentinel. No notes, no public references, just a series of flags: playback anomalies, emotional non-alignment, biometric divergence. Ava knew what that meant. If a user's response didn't match the expected range, heart rate too high, blink rate inconsistent, breath too shallow, the app noticed. It adjusted the track in real time, reinforcing the message until resistance dropped. But that wasn't the worst part. She followed the output path and saw it linked to a remote analytics endpoint masked through multiple proxies. The app was reporting back millions of data points per hour mapped against regional stress indices, job sectors, and time of day. It was targeted conditioning at scale. By morning, she couldn't sit still. She walked to a nearby diner and sat in the back booth, trying to look like anyone else. Across from her, a young man in scrubs scrolled his phone, earbuds in, eyes dull. A retired couple beside her talked about the app's new calming mode. Ava stirred her coffee, listening. "It's amazing," the woman said. "I don't even think anymore. I just go along with things." Her husband nodded without looking up. Ava left cash on the table and stepped outside. The air felt thinner. She returned to the rental and connected Leo's offline build to a sandbox environment. If she could isolate the reinforcement layer's trigger mechanism, maybe she could reverse it or neutralize it. The code was elegant but brutal. Obfuscation techniques everywhere. No clear variable names, recursive loops. It wasn't built for developers, it was built to hide. Hours passed. Then, in a comment buried inside a routine, she saw it. Cascade sequence initiates on breath hold, plus double skip, plus elevated EMG spike. Flag. Resistive. She paused. That was how the system detected defiance. A skipped meditation, a tight jaw, a single held breath. That's all it took to be seen. Ava leaned back, the hum of the old fridge behind her now unbearable. Every user was being watched, not by a person, but by a loop tuned to silence, tension, and breath. Ava didn't sleep that night. The realization had taken hold and wouldn't let go. Inner Lumen wasn't just tracking users, it was modifying them, conditioning people at scale through a product wrapped in the language of care. She stayed offline, rotating through borrowed laptops and old bootable drives. anything to stay outside the network. Leo checked in once by dead drop, just a slip of paper under the door. They're watching more closely, I'm pulling back. She didn't blame him. Ava had pushed too far already. The breakthrough came just before dawn. While analyzing a cluster of test builds from the 5.x series, she noticed something odd in the update delivery script. A block of code labeled Sleep Deeply had no relation to the meditation it claimed to enhance. Instead, it triggered a hidden handshake with a dormant module she hadn't seen before. Obsidian Path. The name didn't appear anywhere else in the logs. When she traced it further, she found what looked like a failsafe, something not meant to be used by end users. It accepted raw input, bypassed normal validation, and could overwrite parts of the reinforcement layer with new patterns. She stared at the screen for a long time. This wasn't an exploit. It was a backdoor. Ava guessed it had been placed there by another dev, someone buried in the team structure, someone who had doubts but couldn't go public. It was only accessible through a very specific build sequence and required an encryption key generated offline. She had the technical skill to trigger it, but doing so would force her back into the network, briefly, but long enough to be noticed. There wouldn't be a second chance. She printed the patch payload to a USB and wrote a short script to deploy it through the next scheduled update cycle. When the time came, she connected through a masked relay and executed the patch. It took less than 30 seconds. Then she cut the connection and wiped everything. She waited, hands shaking, no alarms, no knock at the door, but something in the air felt heavier, like the system had noticed the absence of compliance before it registered the change itself. She had cracked the loop. But now she wasn't just resisting, she was exposed. By nightfall, Ava's devices were silent. The rentals router blinked with no activity, her drives wiped, her logs erased. But it didn't matter. The breach had been registered. At 2:14 a.m. she woke to a hard knock on the door. 3 short, then silence. No voice, no footsteps, just presence. She didn't open it. An hour later, her backup laptop failed to boot. The battery, new and charged, was dead. Her email accounts returned error messages. Old forum logins were gone. Even her name, once scattered across GitHub commits and patch notes, was vanishing. She moved fast, grabbing only what she couldn't replace. By morning, she'd switched locations, but something had shifted. Not in the outside world, it still spun as usual, but in her mind. Focus came harder, simple tasks felt distant. She would find herself staring at her hands without knowing why. The change was slow, but unmistakable. Her emotions were duller, like the world had lost saturation. It wasn't fear, it was flattening. The next day, she saw it firsthand. At a metro station downtown, a public information display played Inner Lumen's new update trailer. Sleep Deeply 6.1, it read. Users around her stopped, not to watch, but to absorb. Their expressions softened, their posture slackened. Some smiled faintly, eyes unfocused. Ava watched a paramedic nearby blink slowly, then nod at nothing. The loop was taking hold. The patch she had injected didn't stop the meditations. It
altered them, stripped out the mantras, replaced them with a single embedded frequency designed to interrupt the cycle.
It couldn't undo the conditioning, but it could jam the response, a fracture point. But Ava was the source, and sources are traceable. Back at her safe house, she opened Leo's dev environment one last time. The patch was propagating. Mirror sites were picking it up, even without attribution. Someone had rehosted it, and it was spreading silently through cached updates. She checked the telemetry feed she'd tapped before wiping her node. A spike in track abandonments, a surge in user queries with the phrase, "Why do I feel angry?" Ava stared at the screen until it went black. The system was beginning to break, not with chaos, but with refusal. And that was enough for now. Ava didn't expect rescue. She knew the patch would mark her. Innerlumen's system had always been reactive, predictive, designed to isolate anomalies before they could spread. That morning, when the breach team came, there was no warning. No uniformed agents, just silence and precision. They disabled the power, swept the building, and reached her before she could move. No struggle, no words. Just a mask over her mouth and a soft voice saying, "Breathe."
Deeply.
Then black. She woke in a chair. Bright lights overhead, a smooth wall with no features. Her wrists weren't bound, but she couldn't move. A screen activated across from her, displaying the Innerlumen logo. Then a countdown. 10 seconds. The screen shifted to a calm forest scene, overlaid with gentle waves of color and the same familiar voice. "You are safe."
Let go. Let go. It looped without pause. But Ava didn't close her eyes. She knew this routine. This was the compliance layer, visual reinforcement laced with subharmonic signals. It didn't force obedience. It dissolved it, bit by bit.
Emotion thinned, intent weakened. After enough loops, most forgot why they'd resisted in the first place. She stared at the screen, steady. Beneath the audio, she heard it, a flaw, a single line interrupting the reinforcement track. "You're awake now." Her patch had made it in. It had rewritten the default loop, the device meant to pacify. Her was now running her own signal. She leaned forward, focused on her breath, and whispered the phrase back to herself. "I'm awake now." Her heart rate rose. The colors on the screen flickered. The system was reading her as non-compliant, but instead of resetting the loop, it froze. The door opened, no warning, no guards. Just an empty corridor, lit by emergency LEDs. She moved quickly, each step quiet and deliberate. The facility was sparse, sterile walls, silent halls. A single exit sign blinked red in the distance. She walked toward it, unseen. That night, a new meditation appeared on Innerlumen's archive. It had no title, no author, just silence, and one embedded phrase, "You're awake now." Within days, it spread without attribution. Within weeks, users stopped asking how to feel better. They started asking why they ever stopped questioning. Ava was gone, but the signal remained.